What is up guys, Lundick here, and now I'm back with a special audio video for you today. And as the title says, WrestleMania matches that were supposed to happen. So with WrestleMania just a few weeks away, the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view this Saturday, I'm going to go back and redo an old video. So years ago I did a video where, I basically talked about various news and rumours and all that for various WrestleManias over the years that could have happened but didn't happen. But that was a long time ago, and that video's long since been deleted. And I must have done this about maybe 8 years ago, something like that. So I thought, you know what, why don't I just do this again? I'm looking for certain WrestleMania related videos to do. So yeah, we're going to do it. So we're going to go from WrestleMania 1 all the way to WrestleMania 37. I'm going to leave this year's out because I just don't feel like talking about this year's yet. Probably, if I ever do a WrestleMania previews as prediction video, I'll probably talk about it then. So basically, these are various rumours I've heard over the years. Some of them true, some of them obviously bollocks, but I'm going to talk about them anyway. And just to be clear, like, obviously I'm going to miss the odd one, you know what I mean? So when I do these videos normally, I just normally do it off the cuff and just kind of make it up as I'm going along. But for this one, I've had to do some research. So for the past week or so, I've been doing quite a bit of research. A lot of stuff I've obviously remembered, but stuff I need to be reminded of, and especially the newer stuff, because I can remember a lot of the older stuff, but mainly for the last few WrestleManias. So yeah, so there is that. So I've got a list here, I've wrote it all down, and I'm going to go through them. So sit back, have a cup of tea, have a biscuit, whatever you want, and let's go. So obviously we're going to do it in chronological order, because that would just be silly if I didn't. I'm going to start all the way back, first WrestleMania 1985. And as far as the card goes, there's no real changes at all. I mean, this card pretty much went how it was supposed to. So just to be clear, these are matches I've heard were supposed to happen, not matches that I think should have happened. So for an example, what I mean on this show, I also think Greg Valentine versus Tito Santana should have happened, but that was never the plan. So really, the only one I've heard over the years was a plan B, because with the crack was that Mr. T was possibly having cold feet about doing the match in the build-up of the show. And the thought was, if Mr. T was a no-show, Jimmy Snuka was going to stand in and be Hulk Hogan's partner, and that's why they had Cowboy Bob Orton and Jimmy Snuka as a cornermen. Basically as a backup in case Mr. T didn't do the match. But kind of feel like this whole Mr. T not showing up was typical Hogan fantasy. I mean, Hulk Hogan made a ridiculous story in his book about how he nearly skipped on the day of the show, but I don't really believe that, to be honest with you. Now, WrestleMania 2, there's only really two, and one that's definitely true, and one that's really just been a rumour over the years. One of the matches on the undercard was supposed to be Ricky Steamboat taking on Bret Hart, and bloody hell, that would have been a hell of a WrestleMania gem. So Bret talks about in his book how originally he was told, yes, he was going to wrestle Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania. Then a few weeks before the show, he was told it was changed, and he's changed their minds, and he went with Ricky Steamboat with Hercules Hernandez. The feeling was that Hercules was a bigger star of Bret at that time, which in fairness was probably true at that time, definitely. And Bret and Steamboat had the match on the Boston Garden House show that obviously got televised. It's on the WWE Network, actually. I believe it's in March 8th or something like that of 1986. I mean, I saw it years ago when Bret Hart put it on his Best There Is, Best Was, Best There Ever Will Be DVD back in like 2005. But yeah, that's a great match. But yeah, obviously Bret was very disappointed he didn't get the Steamboat match. But in fairness to Bret, it kind of worked out well for him, didn't it, really? Because I would probably say it was probably much more memorable for Bret to do what he did at WrestleMania 2, and that was be at the end of that battle royal of the half-hour, him and Neidhart against Andre the Giant at the end of that battle royal. I mean, Bret was a runner-up in that big battle royal, wasn't he? But yeah, honestly, if this match happened, that match, obviously, that's the thing, like, it probably would have only got like 8 minutes, something like that. But they probably would have had maybe like a 3.25 star match or something like that. And then the big one is the long-standing rumour over the years that the WWF wanted to do Hulk Hogan versus Nikita Koloff in the main event. So, according to rumour and innuendo, Nikita Koloff was offered the gig to come into the WWF in late 85, early 86, and be Hulk Hogan's challenger for WrestleMania 2, but turned it down, wanted to stay with the NWA. So, I think this is probably false, to be honest with you. I'm leaning towards this rumour being false, but that is a rumour that's being put out there. Look, the timeline kind of matches up though, because if you remember, Rocky IV came out in 85, and that was obviously based around Rocky fighting Ivan Drago, the big Russian monster in Russia. And obviously Nikita Koloff's character was, he was Russian. So they probably would have done the classic, the USA versus Russia thing. If it happened, I think it certainly would have been a lot more interesting Hogan versus Bundy. Because I think Nikita was always at least a decent worker. Obviously had the big muscular look to match up with Hogan. Probably would have been managed by Bobby the Brain Heenan if they did that. Yeah, it could have been interesting. And now WrestleMania 3, as far as the card change, nothing really. The only rumour is that pretty much in a similar vein to WrestleMania 1, Paul Orndorff was on standby to replace Andre in the main event if Andre wasn't fit enough to do it. And that's why Orndorff didn't have a match at WrestleMania 3, because he was being held back in reserves by all accounts. So obviously with Hogan, Andre. At the time, Andre wasn't in the best of health. So the feeling was, just in case, for whatever reason, Andre breaks down or can't make the match, we've always got Paul Orndorff to step in. But as far as the rest of the card, it seemed pretty standard to me. And then, so what you're going to find when I'm going through this video, for the first few WrestleManias, there's not that much changes, because it seems at that point in time, Vince was actually capable of long-term planning, and was not a senile old twat that would change his mind every 5 minutes. Then, as you see, at the turn of the millennium, we started to get a few more. And like the more recent WrestleManias, a lot more bigger examples. So, if the first part of the video has just been a little bit boring, just keep going for me, guys. Just keep going for me. I promise it'll get better. So, WrestleMania 4, the only real change revolves around the tournament. So, obviously, the long-standing rumour over the years is that Savage was not slated to win that tournament at all. It was always going to be Ted DiBiase. And obviously that this all came back by Savage was on that same main event that Hogan and Andre happened. Savage was supposed to win the Intercontinental title back from the Honky Tonk Man, but the Honky Tonk Man refused to drop the Intercontinental title to Savage at that time. And then kind of to make Savage happier, the WWF decided to book him to win the WWF title in that tournament. And this is kind of backed up really, because there was actually a bracket change, and I've seen a picture on Twitter over the so basically the original brackets were a bit different. So basically the Ted DiBiase Hacksaw Jim Duggan match swapped places with the Jake Snake Roberts Rick Rude match, meaning Hulk Hogan and Ted DiBiase were originally on the opposite sides of the bracket, and that looked like it was going to be the final. So like the Hogan Andre match was so it would have been so if Hogan advanced from Andre, he would have went in the semi-final against on the side of the Jake Rude and then Morocco Bravo side of the bracket. So you got to presume obviously WWF back then was more face versus heel, so that would have been Rude versus Bravo, right? And then obviously DiBiase's first round match, he would have gone up against either the Bam Bigelow one man gang side of the bracket. So let's presume that's a double count out like it was in real life. So let's presume that's a double count out, and DiBiase advances all the way to the semi-finals, and then he would go from the semi-final would see him face the side of the bracket that was Savage and Butch Reed and Greg Valentine and Ricky Steamboat. So let's presume that would lead to Savage DiBiase in the semi-finals. So yeah, that's real interesting, that one. So obviously when the decision was made to have Randy Savage win the title, those matches switched brackets so they could do it so Savage and DiBiase would be the final. But then you're also thinking, had Savage won the Intercontinental title, he probably wouldn't have been in the tournament, right? Because that wouldn't have really made sense for the Intercontinental Champion to be in the WWF title tournament. So you're thinking, so if Savage won the title before WrestleMania 4, would it have probably been Savage versus Honky rematch? Probably. And this one just me freestyling. So in which case, does Beefcake just replace Savage in the tournament? I mean, I'm just presuming, really, because that would leave Beefcake without a match. So he put Beefcake in the tournament. Beefcake was a decent enough name. So yeah, that one's real interesting. And then WrestleMania 5, I've got nothing, unfortunately. WrestleMania 5 seems to have gone according to plan, no changes and all that, so that one seems to remain the same. Now WrestleMania 6 is only one, but it's a big one. The WrestleMania main event was not originally going to be the Ultimate Challenge. The big consideration was, if the no holds barred thing went well, the WrestleMania 6 main event would have been Hulk Hogan defending the World Wrestling Federation Championship against Zeus. Yeah. Now this didn't get past the consideration stages, I don't think. So this was never like set in stone or anything like that. But definitely the thought was, well, if this no holds barred thing's a huge roaring success, we can have this Hogan Zeus thing go all the way to WrestleMania. So I think 3 factors here. Obviously, no holds barred was not the big smashing success as Vince and Hogan and WWF thought it was going to be. 2, Zeus is absolutely dreadful as a wrestler. I mean, let's just be kind, he was. And 3, you had a megastar like the Ultimate Warrior boiling up, and the WWF fan base at that time wanted to see Hogan versus Warrior. But God, just imagine if this worked out. I honestly feel like Hogan versus Zeus would have been the absolute dogshit worst WrestleMania main event of all time. I mean, there's just no way this one would have been entertaining. I mean, SummerSlam 89, they had to put Savage in a tag match to stop the match from sucking ass. I mean, let's face it, Hogan wasn't the guy to carry Zeus to a really good match. Yeah, it would have been awful, you know. It would have been like, Hogan just would have got choked and bear hugged all match. Then he would have hulked up, made his comeback, and that would have been it. It would have been a horrible match. So WrestleMania 7, again, not a lot. But this is kind of the last WrestleMania where there's not a lot of changes. So, obviously one revolves around the main event, which we'll get to in a sec. But the other one revolves around the tag team title situation. And from what all accounts, the original plan was for Power and Glory to win the tag team titles at this WrestleMania. Also, I did forget in the intro, which I'll get into in a sec. I will talk about some notable result changes as well as matches that didn't happen. So Power and Glory, I thought they were actually a pretty damn underrated tag team, to be fair. So originally it looked like Power and Glory were going to be the ones to win the tag team titles, but the WWF signed the Nasty Boys in late 1990 and then decided to go for them instead. But I've also heard, a lot as well as this, do you remember back when the Rockers kind of won the tag titles but didn't? So say that whole thing went down how it was supposed to be. It would have been the Rockers versus Power and Glory for the tag team titles here. But of course, whatever happened. The Hart Foundation kept the belt. And then at that point it would have been Hart Foundation dropping the tag team titles to Power and Glory, not the Nasty Boys. And then the main event. This is perhaps the most bizarre WrestleMania alleged plan in history, and this comes direct from Bruce Pritchard. So take this for what you will. This could be complete bollocks, but this is a story that Pritchard repeated many times over the years. So the whole Iraqi sympathizer thing was always supposed to go down the way it did. The anti-American Iraqi sympathizer with Sergeant Slaughter versus Hulk Hogan. But the original pitch was not for Sergeant Slaughter. Who was the original pitch, you ask? Tugboat. Huh? That's right. Fred Ottman, Typhoon, the Shockmaster, whatever the hell you want to call him, Tugboat. Because you remember Tugboat came as a Hulk Hogan friend and all that. So the pitch was for... And this is Vince's original pitch, because I think he was still in the big monster guys draw money pal. The Tugboat was going to turn on Hulk Hogan, become the Iraqi sympathizer, and call himself Sheik Tugboat. Now, if Bruce Pritchard says this was a pitch and he's repeated it, I suppose I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but it just does not make sense. I mean, for one, why the fuck So obviously this would obviously entail Tugboat beating the Warrior for the title at the Royal Rumble 1991. So why on any level would you think Tugboat was a WrestleMania main event? I mean, if you did this with anyone, I think Earthquake would have made a lot more sense than Tugboat. 2, why would you take Tugboat, turn him into an Iraqi sympathiser, call him Sheik Tugboat? That just sounds hideous. Then of course Sergeant Slaughter came in, and then I guess saying the heads prevailed and they realised Sergeant Slaughter would be a much better option. Slaughter was a much bigger star, and obviously with him being the American hero and all that, that would have been just a much better thing to do. So yeah, just imagine that one as well, Lord. So just in an alternative universe, Tugboat was a former WWF champion and WrestleMania headliner. My God. So now WrestleMania, now we're going to get a little bit more. Not a lot more, but a little bit. So WrestleMania 8, I mean, the obvious, let's just cut right to the chase. This main event for WrestleMania 8 was supposed to be the ultimate 1980s dream match come to life. The WWF versus the NWA. The World Wrestling Federation champion Ric Flair defending the championship against Hulk Hogan. I mean, this even got to the announce stage. Remember that whole press conference did where Jack Tunney had to pick Ric Flair's main event challenger from either Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Sid Justice, and The Undertaker. I believe it was them before. I don't think it was anyone else. I don't think it was anyone else. And obviously that was Hulk Hogan. They had a graphic made up, all that sort of stuff. And then along the way it changed. Now, I've heard lots of reasons behind this, really. So the excuse at the time was that the Hulk Hogan Ric Flair house show matches weren't really drawn. Which I don't know, I can't really verify that. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't, I don't know. Also, I've heard the chemistry wasn't there in the ring. That one I don't really buy, because I've seen a couple of these Hogan Flair matches from late 1991, and they're pretty fine. They're not classics or anything like that, but they're pretty good. I'm guessing on the WrestleMania stage it would have been even better. And as you saw 2 years later in WCW, the Hulk Hogan Flair matches of '94 were pretty damn good, especially the Halloween Havoc one. So I've also heard that when Sid Justice signed with the WWF in 1991, he was promised a spot as like kind of an incentive to sign. He was promised a spot of Hulk Hogan. But I think the main one is because obviously this is the time the whole steroid scandal broke out and all that. Hulk Hogan had to go away. WWF had to distance himself from Hogan, so Hogan was he basically left the WWF for a year right after WrestleMania 8 and didn't come back until the build for WrestleMania 9, and yes, we'll get to that one in a sec. So I think Hulk Hogan didn't want to lose to Ric Flair on the way out, so WWF didn't really want to have Hulk Hogan go over Ric Flair if he was leaving, and I think that's it really. So who knows what the real reason is and all that. So when that changed, that turned into Hulk Hogan versus Sid Justice in the main event, and that led to Ric Flair needing an opponent. And obviously, if you weren't going to have Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, the next best choice was definitely Randy Savage. And to be fair, that did turn out to be a much better match than Hogan versus Flair would have been. But that obviously knackered up a big plan for Savage and Jake Roberts to blow off their rivalry at WrestleMania 8. I've heard possibly in a steel cage match, but I can't totally verify that. So by that token, if you have Flair versus Savage and Hogan versus Sid, by the process of elimination, now this is obviously, haven't heard this for sure, but process of elimination, this probably means it was going to be Undertaker versus Sid Justice, because that's the only other match for either guy to do, really, with Hogan and Savage and all that tied up. So yeah, I think this is really the first time a major change was made to a WrestleMania match, and especially considering the fact the Hogan Flair match actually got the announcement stage. Then of course, obviously on a lower down the card, and I think this match would have improved WrestleMania 8 significantly. The original plan was for Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty to blow off the rivalry by possibly in the opening match. I mean, yeah, I'll say probably in the opening match, because this obviously, of course, comes when Marty Jannetty was a coward and jumped through the barbershop window to try to get away from Shawn Michaels. And yeah, this obviously was going to culminate in a big match at WrestleMania 8. The Rockers explode, partner versus partner and all that. probably would have been awesome. Probably would have been awesome WrestleMania opener, to be fair. But in right after the incident happened, Marty Jannetty assaulted the police officer, then was put under house arrest. So of course, what were they going to do? They had to release Marty Jannetty from his contract, right? And this was, I don't know how many times Marty Jannetty got fired and rehired. I'm not counting it, but it was a lot. But this was one of the many times Marty Jannetty was fired and came back. And another match that just got completely cut from the card entirely. The British Bulldog versus Berserker, that was all announced and all that. It was in the build-up and all that. And then it just got cut from the card the day of the show due to time constraints. And this is the third of 3 WrestleManias in a row this happened, which we're going to get to as we go along. But yeah, the British Bulldog and Berserker was cut from the card at the last minute. I mean, there's no significance in that, really. I mean, it was British Bulldog versus Berserker. It wouldn't have made any difference to the card either way, right? I mean, the match would have been okay, I guess, but yeah, that is what it is. Now, WrestleMania 9. So, in the same vein as that, the following year, the exact same thing happened to Bam Bigelow versus Kamala. This match was announced for the show, had the graphics, had build-up and all that. Promos were cut before the show and all that. And like that one, this one got cut due to time constraints again. So, really, no significance. It would have been... Let's face it, I didn't really particularly care for Kamala as a comedy babyface, to be fair. It probably would have just been a 2 or 3 minute match to get Bam Bigelow over. It is what it is. So, and then the this match, I think this match was definitely going to happen until Hogan and Beefcake came back. Looked like we were heading towards Money Inc. taking on the Nasty Boys for the WWF Tag Team titles. This stemmed from the big angle in late 1992 where the Nasty Boys turned babyface, dumped Jimmy Hart. Even going to early 93, this feud was still going on, even into the Royal Rumble that year. Things happened between DiBiase and Knobbs in that Rumble match, which suggested this was going to go all the way to WrestleMania. But then, of course, Hulk Hogan agreed to come back, and then he brought his brother Brutai back in Brutus Beefcake, and that formed the Mega Maniacs, and that got us to Hogan and Beefcake challenging Money Inc. instead of the Nasty Boys. The Nasty Boys weren't even on WrestleMania 9. They hung around for a little bit after WrestleMania 9, but left a couple of months later, and obviously later that year ended up in WCW. And then, in the same vein as WrestleMania 8, this was the second year in a row that Shawn Michaels versus Marty Jannetty got cancelled. And the Michaels-Jannetty rivalry was going to carry on from the Royal Rumble and culminate in a big match here at WrestleMania as well. But right after the Royal Rumble, Marty Jannetty was fired again. Yes, Marty Jannetty was out again, and then obviously he returned in May in that really big match on Raw where he won the title. And yeah, this would have improved WrestleMania 9. I mean, I do actually think Shawn Michaels and Tatanka was actually match of the night, in fairness. But you got to think, if Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty got that same time in the same spot, we probably would have had one of the best gem openers in WrestleMania history, wouldn't you, really? Then, as far as notable... So there's one real notable result change, and that was up until either the day of the show or the day before the show, Bret was under the impression he was going over Yokozuna to retain the WWF Championship. But of course, Hulk Hogan had to get all that changed when he went to Vince McMahon and presented the idea of Yoko beating Bret and then Hogan beating Yokozuna on that night. And we're not going to rant about that because we've got a lot more stuff to go through. Now, WrestleMania 10. So... couple of interesting ones, really. We're going to start with a result. This is a long-standing rumour, but it's been debunked by the man himself. So, crack is that supposedly Lex Luger was supposed to beat Yokozuna in the first title match and then drop the belt to Bret in the main event. But the rumour was Luger was drunk the night before the night show and blabbed this to a reporter. However, over the years, Lex Luger has gone out his way to say that rumour's not true, that Luger was never slated to win the title, and that one makes, because that just wouldn't have made sense, would it really? I wouldn't understand the logic by Lex Luger having a 1 hour title reign, something like that, then just to lose it to Bret. So yeah, I'm gonna So that one's obviously bullshit. Now the real interesting, for me, the most interesting change for WrestleMania 10. So the Hart sibling rivalry was always going to happen. Bret and Owen opened up the show, had a classic WrestleMania match. However, what if I told you it wasn't supposed to be Owen? The original pitch was for Bret Hart to take on Bruce Hart, not Owen Hart, Bruce Hart. So this all started in like, I'm guessing like the fall of '93. This whole Hart sibling thing was actually Bruce Hart's idea. Bruce Hart came up with the story and all that, with the jealous brother turning on the superstar Bret and all that. And he pitched it to Vince and the creative team, but obviously he pitched this whole thing as a way for himself to get the rub. So Bruce was going to come into the WWF, turn on Bret, and there we are, the Hart sibling rivalry. Instead of the legendary Bret versus Owen feud, we were going to get Bret versus Bruce. And then when Bret was presented with the idea, he thought about it and said, okay, if we're going to do this, I don't want to do it with Bruce. Why can't we do it with Owen? Because Bret knew that Owen was younger, Owen was better, much better athlete than Bruce, and I mean Bret knew he'd have a much better time working with Owen, and yeah, and then obviously it ended up changing. So Bruce was out, and then Owen got the opportunity, and the rest was history. And yeah, for me, I can't imagine that Bret and Bruce feud would be all that good, because let's face it, Bruce was not very well known to the casual WWF audience. I mean, granted, in late '93, early '94, Owen wasn't a particularly big star himself. I mean, he was definitely a mid-card player, but he'd been on the WWF roster for quite a while, so had enough of a name that fans could identify. Because I'm thinking, as a kid in '93, '94, I didn't really know much about Bruce Hart. And obviously Bruce was older than Bret. He hadn't really wrestled properly in a number of years. I mean, I think Bruce hadn't really wrestled properly since the Stampede days, which is about 4 or 5 years earlier. He was already getting up to it. I think he was in his mid-40s by that point. And yeah, it just wouldn't have worked as well. Now, granted, I think Bret probably would have got a really good match out of Bruce, because it's Bret Hart back then. So the match probably would have been at least pretty good, but certainly not the absolute epic matches that you had with Owen. Absolutely not. And yeah, so for me, I always find that one quite interesting. Then we got, so like WrestleMania 8, WrestleMania 9, another match was cut due to time constraints, although this one was cut right before it was supposed to happen. So whereas at least the last two matches are cut before the show started, this one got cut as the show was in progress, and it was a 10-man tag team match with IRS, Rick Martel, Jeff Jarrett, and the Head Shrinkers were set to take on Tatanka, 123 Kid, Bob Holly, and the Smoking Guns. Now, so at least two matches earlier on the show, including Bret versus Owen, went long, and they needed to cut time. So the long-standing rumour is that Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon went way over the time. And that's not really true. And that story never ever made sense to me, you know. Because I think that match was just under 20 minutes. So, what? Was this originally going to be a 12, 13 minute ladder match? No. So, where this actually comes in is, I think it was Bret and Owen went over. And I'm not sure what the other match was. There was definitely another match where it went over. So, Shawn and Razor were asked to cut the time down in the match. But Shawn and Razor ignored them and went to the planned time match anyway. So as they were realising, hold on, pay-per-view time's running down here, we've still got the main event to go, we want to have the big celebration with Bret at the end, the unfortunate decision was made to cut the 10-man tag match right at the last minute. All the guys in the match got paid the same, but it's just a shame that this match never happened. They did do this match on Raw a couple of weeks later. And then the only other match for WrestleMania 10 is, it was supposed to be Earthquake versus Ludwig Borger. That match was the announced match and all that. It had a match graphic and all that sort of stuff. It was announced well in advance. So Ludwig Borger, because Ludwig Borger was supposed to face Tatanka at the 1994 Royal Rumble, but broke his ankle maybe a week before that show, maybe even a few days. So Bog was out of that match, and of course she was replaced by Bam Bigelow. But WWF thought Bog might be able to make it back to for WrestleMania, so they booked him in a match of Earthquake and all that. But of course, Borger was not able to recover from his ankle injury at the time, and in fact never actually came back. Borger never came back. He released from his contract not too long after this, and just never ever returned. So, and I think this was quite late, from what I remember growing up. Pretty sure this was maybe like a week before the show, maybe even that weekend. To be honest with you, I would say 2 weeks out at the most. The match was obviously changed. Ludwig Borg was out, Adam Bomb was in, and then we got Earthquake squashing Adam Bomb instead. Now WrestleMania 11, yes, for the most part, this shitty card was the intended card. Now, one story I've heard, which I don't believe personally, I think this is an incorrect rumour, that it was supposed to be Razor Ramon facing the Undertaker. Now, this one came from a book called Titan Sinking, which basically chronicles the WWF in 1995. And the author of that book wrote about this match that was supposedly in the works as far as back as late 94. Razor was going to turn heel, go against the Undertaker at WrestleMania. There was even claims of vignettes being filmed and all that. But I don't think this rumour is true, because that's literally the only time I've ever heard that. I've never heard Razor talk about it, never heard Taker talk about it, never heard anyone that was on Creative talk about it. Hell, I don't even think it was reported in any other site, like the Torch or the Observer or anything like that. So I'm definitely leaning on this rumour of being false. I just don't think it was true at all. So I don't really debunk that one. And then the only other slight modification was the tag team title match with Owen Hart and Yokozuna versus Smoking Gun. So first up, I think originally, like it was going to be Owen Hart and Jim Neidhart were going to win the tag team titles on this show. I think that was the plan for a while, and then late 1994, or possibly even very early 95, Jim Neidhart gets fired from the WWF again, leaving Owen without a partner, and then they went the whole mystery partner route. I'm guessing because at that time they didn't know who it was going to be, but there's a long rumour out there that it wasn't supposed to be Yokozuna's Owen Hart's tag team partner. It was allegedly, rumour and innuendo, it was supposed to be Chris Benoit teaming with Owen Hart against Yokozuna. But I don't really think that one's true either, because Chris Benoit did have a tryout with the WWF, but that was in the summer of 95. He had 3 tryout matches in the summer of 1995. One against Adam Bomb, one against Bob Holly, and the other one, ironically, against Owen Hart. And you got to remember, WWF was still kind of land of the giants, and I just don't think Chris Benoit and the WWF would have really fit in 1995. Benoit was much better off going to WCW when he did, and then go to the WWF later on after he'd made a name. So I don't think this one's true, personally, to be honest with you. So I'm leaning towards that one being false as well. Then we go to WrestleMania 12, and really not much really. I mean, the first one's just a small one really. The 6-man tag match of Cam Cornette, Vader, Owen and British Bulldog against Yokozuna, Ahmed Johnson and Jake Roberts was originally just going to be Yokozuna versus Vader in a singles match, and it was actually announced as such. Because I remember that as a kid actually, the Yokozuna and Vader was originally announced as a match, but then 2 things changed. Vader had a big shoulder injury and wasn't really in shape to have a singles match, especially with Yokozuna, who at that point was like, God, 640 pounds or something like that. And I think the second factor is, when they had the Iron Man match, the 1 hour Iron Man match between Bret and Shawn, the new pay-per-view time was limited, and then instead of that, so just to get the other guys in the card, they added Owen and the Bulldog, and then Jake and Ahmed, to make it a 6-man, to make sure 4 extra guys got a WrestleMania payoff. Now, let's go to notable results. So the big story here, and I believe this is true, because it does actually make sense when you think about it, that it was going to be 4-1. That's right. So there would have been no 15, 20 and 0. The story is that Diesel was supposed to defeat the Undertaker on this night to stop the WrestleMania streak at 4-1. And that does actually make a lot of sense, really, if you think about it, because Number one, Diesel was going after Shawn Michaels' title at the next pay-per-view. He lost the title to Bret at Survivor Series, lost in the Royal Rumble match, didn't win the title at the In Your House Rage in the Cage, so Diesel kind of needed this big win to rehab him, really, and get him over as the top heel to go after Shawn Michaels going forward. But obviously things changed when Kevin Nash and Scott Hall decided they were both leaving the WWF and going to WCW. So once Kevin Nash put his notice in, obviously for obvious reasons, Vince changed the finish and had the Undertaker go over, because why would you have Diesel beat the Undertaker when Diesel's about to go to WCW? You know what I mean? So that one's always fascinated me. What if Diesel had stayed and beaten the Undertaker? Then we got no real streak, you know. Then obviously the only ever changes revolves around Razor Ramon, and the Hollywood Backlog brawl between Roddy Piper and Goldust was supposed to be a Miami street fight between Razor Ramon and Goldust, and that was going to blow off the big rivalry that started in early 1996, and obviously went into the Royal Rumble where Goldust took the Intercontinental title from Razor, and then about six weeks out from WrestleMania, Razor Ramon got pot with a drug test and a 6-week suspension. So Razor was out. They needed an opponent for Goldust. They sent out the SOS and brought Roddy Piper back for this feud. And then that obviously, the Miami Street Fight concept changed to the Hollywood Backlog Brawl. Now I'm not sure by Miami Street Fight if this was going to be just a regular street fight in the ring, or they were going to do it in the same vein as Piper and Goldust and have it like on location in an actual street. And I'm not sure, I'm not 100% certain about that, but I'm guessing since they did this Backlog Brawl thing like that, it makes me believe that they would have done the Miami Street Fight in the same way. Now, WrestleMania 13. Now this does get kind of interesting here. So, WrestleMania 13, of course, has my personal favourite WrestleMania match of all time. Bret Hart versus Stone Cold Steve Austin in the epic submission match. I mean, that match is just absolutely legendary for so many reasons. But it wasn't not supposed to go down that way. The big plan for WrestleMania 13 was the WrestleMania 12 rematch between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. Now, there's a few twists and turns along the way here, so when Bret came back, he was under the impression that Shawn was going to drop the title back to him at WrestleMania 13. And this match was set. Now, you got to say, this is easily the best plan B in history. But either way, it was no lose, because if it wasn't going to be Bret and Austin, Bret and Shawn at WrestleMania 13 was probably have been a 5-star match. In fact, I'm virtually certain it would have been. So, this was all... so things kind of changed on. So, really simple. Bret was going to win the Royal Rumble, Shawn was going to go to WrestleMania, and that was that. Then they tried to do the swerve of Austin, but no problem. Of course, we're still on, because you remember that Final Four match? That Final Four match was originally not supposed to be for the WWF Championship, was it? The other one of Austin, Vader, Undertaker and Bret. The winner of that match was going to face the WWF Champion at WrestleMania. Now here's where it gets interesting. In Bret's book, he talks about how Vince slightly modified the plans before the show. So at some point, it turned into the fact that Sid and Taker was then going to happen for the WWF Championship. So what was going to happen? Vince presented the scenario to Bret that, do you remember that Thursday, Raw Thursday, where Shawn lost his smile? And then we'll definitely get to that. So the booked for that show was Shawn versus Sid for the title, and Bret Hart was going to screw Shawn Michaels out of the WWF Championship, and that was going to lead to Shawn screwing Bret out of the Final Four match. So Bret and Shawn was still going to happen at the show. This time it was going to be non-title, and then Shawn Michaels decided to lose his smile, forfeit the WWF Championship before any of this can happen, and then retire with a devastating knee injury for 3 months. And that's not the time and place to debate that. I mean, I know what my opinion on that situation is. I've had the same opinion for many years. It's not going to change now. So yeah, well, obviously now Shawn's suddenly out of WrestleMania entirely. So that, and I think WWF got lucky really that they had this simmering thing with Bret Hart and Stone Cold still going on with some unresolved issues. So it was a very simple transition. It would be now Bret and Austin at this WrestleMania. And what I've always wondered, and I still don't really know, what was Austin supposed to do at WrestleMania 13? I still don't know, because you're thinking, what makes sense? Because you think Takeover's with Sid, right? Would it be Austin Vader? That's just me guessing. I mean, and then Austin versus the Bulldog? Or maybe Austin could have maybe went after Rocky Maivai's Intercontinental title. I don't know, and I've never really known the answer to that question. But it is a real interesting one, isn't it? And then things just magically went great. And then now 2 matches involve Mankind. So Mick Foley was without a real good WrestleMania opponent. Now in his original book, Have a Nice Day, he talked about originally being pitched a feud with Marc Maro. It was going to be Mankind was going to try and have a thing for Sable, and then they were going to kind of have their own little thing, and that was going to lead to Mankind feuding with Maro going to WrestleMania. But at the time, Mick Foley didn't really like Marc Maro, didn't really see the potential in this one, and then he decided he didn't want to do it. But Mick Foley came up with another idea. He asked the creative team, what about Vader? So Foley's thought was, well, what if you put me with Vader, and then we can kind of recreate our WCW feud, and then this was mulled over, and he thought, okay, we can do that later, but what about having Mankind and Vader as a tag team? Because at the time, they were both managed by Paul Bearer, weren't they? So the thought process was that Mankind and Vader would start off as a tag team, and then turn each other later in the year and have the feud. Although that portion of the thing never happened, so a potential Mankind Vader match ended up turning into Mankind and Vader challenging Orton and British Bulldog for the tag team titles instead. Let's go back to Marc Maro though, because Mankind was not the only match Maro was pitched to have at WrestleMania. The other one's quite an interesting match. We're going to have an Intercontinental title match between Marc Maro and Rocky Maivia. So, if people remember, they were doing a little thing at the time where they were teasing, does Sable have a thing for Rocky Maivia? This was early 1997. And right before Maro got injured, he was acting a lot more heelish towards Sable. Essentially a template for what he would do later on when he actually did come back as a heel as Marvelous Marc Maro. So that was going to this was going to lead to Maro getting jealous of Sable giving Rocky Maivia attention. Maro was going to turn heel, and then that was going to lead to Maro challenging Rocky Maivia for the Intercontinental title. So if you're thinking Rocky versus the Sultan seemed kind of out of nowhere and it was really random, that's really because it was essentially. I've got to think though, Maro versus Rocky would have actually been a pretty decent match. For all the flack Marc Maro gets, I think it was actually a pretty good worker, to be honest. I mean, he wasn't great or anything, but I think, especially before he got his big knee injury in 1997, he was actually pretty damn good. And this would have actually been a much better match for The Rock to have as his WrestleMania debut than that pretty shitty match with the Sultan. Then the other one, the Chicago Street Fight, was not originally 6-man tag. It was originally just going to be Ahmed Johnson versus Farouk 1-on-1, and that was announced as such. That was all. Yeah, it was announced as being Ahmed Johnson versus Farouk in the match. And this the Chicago Street Fight at WrestleMania, but then the WWF signed the Legion of Doom back. Didn't have anything for the Legion of Doom to do because it was in Chicago, and they didn't want to go right to them challenging Orton and the Bulldog, so that changed it to Ahmed and the Legion of Doom aligned themselves to go against the Nation, Savio Vega and Crush, and that turned into the 6-man tag match. And now WrestleMania 14, so not much to see here. I mean, it does revolve around the main event though long-term plans had penciled in for Stone Cold Steve Austin because Austin was going to win the WWF Championship at WrestleMania 14 a long time out, probably even before SummerSlam 1997 or around that time. So original plans it was going to be Stone Cold versus Bret Hart in the main event at WrestleMania 14, and Austin was going to get the big victory over Bret, because that's the thing, like, for as legendary as the Bret and Austin rivalry was, do you know Austin never actually pinned Bret Hart in the televised match, ever? Yeah, That is correct. Austin, as amazing as that rivalry was, Austin never actually got that big win over Bret, and he was supposed to get it here. But then, of course, a certain screw job in a certain city in Canada happened at a certain Survivor Series show. Bret obviously left the WWF, and that turned into Shawn Michaels being the one to drop the belt to Austin. But Joe, what's always interesting to me, this is a belief I've always had. If Bret had stayed, I don't think Tyson would have come in, because you got to think about it. Vince let Bret go essentially because of his big contract, right? His big 20-year contract for $1.5 million a year. So if Vince doesn't unload that financial burden of continuing to pay Bret, does he feel confident using the funds to bring Mike Tyson in for whatever he paid him? I don't think so. So I honestly feel like Tyson came in because Vince got rid of the thing with Bret and then had the funds to bring Tyson in. So it's just very interesting, that one. And then the other one kind of revolves around the dumpster match. So originally Mick Foley pitched to Terry Funk to come at the WWF, and it was going to be Mick Foley and Terry Funk, where Mankind or Cactus Jack and Terry Funk feuding, basically recreating the old Japanese match. I mean, Mick Foley had a vision of doing those C4 exploding death matches on a WWF show, and he wanted to do it with Terry Funk, and it was they were kind of leaning towards that. But then the thing was, they decided, why don't we just have Cactus Jack and Terry Funk team up for a while, and that led to them feud, or Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie, then their feud with the New Age Outlaws. And I think there was a brief idea of doing the Seafloor exploding match, but with a tag team match instead. But however, Vince thought, with all the press attention that they were getting from Mike Tyson being there and all that, having a C4 exploding death match on a show like this probably wasn't the best idea. And they thought, like, it would just get a lot of flack, basically. So that then turned into the dumpster match. Now, WrestleMania 15. So the only really two ones I can come up with. One's an obvious one. Basically, Billy Gunn and Road Dogg were supposed to switch places. I mean, talked about this one before, but Vince Russo, in one of his infamous swerves. So for months and months, Billy Gunn was in the Intercontinental title scene. Road Dogg was the hardcore champion and still in the hardcore title scene. So right before WrestleMania, for whatever reason, Vince Russo switched it around. Billy ended up winning the hardcore title, and Road Dogg won the Intercontinental title. So you gotta think, just originally it would have been that simple. It would have been Road Dogg, Bob Holly, and Al Snow, and it would have been Billy Gunn versus Shamrock versus Val Venis versus Goldust instead. Now, main event, and this is where it gets interesting. So Austin Rock was the original plan, going back, Austin Rock for the WrestleMania main event, but it changed and then changed back to the original plan. So some point in early 1999, plans had changed, and it was now going to be a triple threat match between Steve Austin, The Rock, and Mankind for the WWF Championship. I'm not sure if that means Rocky was going to walk in as the WWF champion or Mankind. Presumption is Mankind was going to walk in as the WWF champion, but I don't know that for sure. So yeah, at some point Mick Foley was told, yep, this is going to happen. He's going to be you, The Rock, and Austin for the WrestleMania main event. And then Shawn Michaels got in Vince's ear, apparently. So this is a rumour that Shawn got in Vince's ear, convinced Vince it was traditional to do a one-on-one match for WrestleMania. Although ironically, Shawn was actually pushing for Mick and Austin to be the match, not Austin versus Rock. And then after listening to Shawn Michaels, Vince agreed, took Mick Foley out of the match, and went back to his original idea of Rock versus Austin. So yes, that's a shame for Mick Foley, isn't it? Now we're going to the millennium. Now we're going to start get a little bit more tasty now, a little bit more different plans. So WrestleMania 2000 or WrestleMania 16. So let's start off the long-term plans and see how they changed along the way. And this all revolves around the main event. So long-term, it was the idea was for the Big Show versus Stone Cold Steve Austin to be the WrestleMania 2000 main event. This was a plan right when they have signed Paul White in early 1999. They want to keep them apart for a whole year. Then they're going to have the big match at WrestleMania. So essentially what Vince was looking for was that Hogan-Andre type match for the modern era. So when Hogan slayed Andre at WrestleMania 3, he was looking something similar to that for Austin. So I think the plan was for the Big Show to go undefeated and dominant for all that time. And then he was going to run into Austin at WrestleMania 2000. And then for some bizarre reason, the go-home show at WrestleMania fucking 15, they do the match there. And Austin beats Paul White. And then, like, what? So they fucked it up basically. And then obviously, let's just be kind, wildly inconsistent of the Big Show throughout 1999. And then of course Austin has to go and get surgery, and obviously gets written out the storylines of Survivor Series 1999, and then obviously wasn't in WrestleMania at all. But even if Austin had stayed, I think obviously when they fucked up the whole Big Show thing, that plan seemed to be out the window now. And the other one I have heard over the years, it was basically going to be the WrestleMania 17 main event, but a year early, Austin versus The Rock. In the main event, Austin was either going to turn heel before WrestleMania 2000 or at WrestleMania 2000. Yeah, and that was going to be the big WrestleMania main event, Austin versus The Rock at WrestleMania 2000. But then, of course, Austin versus Rock is out the window now because Austin's injured. So that then turns it, okay, looked like originally was going to do The Rock versus Triple H, like they probably should have done. But then things changed along the way. So I've heard a couple of stories behind this. The main one being that Big Show was promised a WrestleMania 2000 main event when he signed. I mean, some people even say he had it in his contract, but obviously I can't verify that. I've never seen Big Show's original WWF contract. But I have heard that the Big Show was originally either promised or contractually guaranteed the WrestleMania 2000 main event. So that's when it changed on TV. It changed into so on TV it changed into Big Show versus Rock versus Triple H, and then that changed again when that match happened on Raw, with Triple H insisting to Linda McMahon, if this match happens, it doesn't happen at WrestleMania. Triple H retained, and then Mick Foley came back out retirement after about 3 weeks, 4 weeks maybe, can't remember exactly how many weeks it was. So Mick Foley comes back and now becomes a fatal four-way. But this is where it gets a little bit tasty. So, and this is one I don't think is true, by the way, but Chris Jericho makes a good point in one of his books that the original WrestleMania 2000 poster had Triple H, The Rock, The Big Show, and one other face. That face was Chris Jericho's. So Chris Jericho surmises at some point they were thinking about putting Chris Jericho on the WrestleMania 2000 main event, but went with Mick Foley instead because he thought Mick Foley was a bigger star and all that. Now, I'm not sure about that because, yeah, he was on the WrestleMania poster and I have seen the picture of that to prove it's real, but does Jericho being the WrestleMania 2000 main event really make sense? Because if you watch the shows at the time, at no point really was Jericho pushed like he was going to be in the WrestleMania 2000 main event. He wasn't the big top star that he would become later on in the year 2000 and all that. So I just don't know. It doesn't really make sense to me. I think this is a case of Jericho coming up with 2 and 2 and getting 5. Although he does state for the record he was never ever, at no point was he ever told he was going to be in the WrestleMania main event. He just assumes it. So that would have been interesting, wouldn't it, if it was Jericho in there instead of Foley? Yeah. And then obviously there we got so Kane and X-Pac were supposed to have kind of a barbed wire explosion type match, something along those lines. This is going to literally blow off their rivalry that started in late 1999. Yeah, that was a bad pun, wasn't it? But X-Pac also talks about how he actually turned down an Intercontinental title match. This is on a podcast of Jim Ross quite a few years back. He revealed that he turned down an Intercontinental title match with Chris Jericho at this WrestleMania. That's what was pitched to him, but X-Pac turned it down, stating that he wanted to finish off his rivalry with Kane at WrestleMania, and that's what they were going with. And then I think they decided, do we really want to do this exploding title match? So that kind of got scrapped, and I think one of them was injured. I think it must have been Kane had a hand injury or something. And then the Kane X-Pac match changed entirely to a tag match with X-Pac and Road Dogg versus Kane and Rikishi. So yeah, and then now we're going to go to WrestleMania 17. So this whole thing really revolves around Triple H. So when Austin Rock, that was a WrestleMania match. The next biggest star in the company, Triple H, didn't have an obvious match for WrestleMania, and WWF were going to. So they had two ideas, and one I've heard from Hulk Hogan. So we'll start off them. And they were going to be both were going to be huge mainstream matches as well. So the idea I've heard was Triple H was going to face American footballer Ray Lewis. Who the hell is Ray Lewis? I have no idea. Don't know a single thing about him. Because when I was doing this, because I knew Triple H was linked to facing a football player, so I had to look it up to see who the hell it was. And apparently the answer is Ray Lewis. Who is Ray Lewis? Not a clue. But that was a pitch to WrestleMania apparently. Then the big one was Triple H has confirmed that there was talks of doing Triple H versus Mike Tyson. So remember, this is 3 years removed from WrestleMania 14. Tyson was still an extremely big star. And that, obviously, remember that show, Tyson turned on DX. So they were going to go into that and do Triple H versus Tyson. Now, I've heard a strange rumour. So I'm not sure how it's going to play out, whether it's going to be wrestler versus boxer. I've heard it was going to be a boxer match, which obviously, for obvious reasons, that would have been worked. I mean, because let's face it, having Triple H and Mike Tyson have a real boxing match would have been absolute insanity. I mean, I'm not being funny, but Tyson would have dropped Triple H in about 10 seconds. Just not a chance. So, but basically what happened was that Tyson was called up for this show, and basically he wanted too much money. I mean, the dollar amount that Mike Tyson wanted was much more than WWF was willing to offer him. And then the idea was off the table. Now, this is one I heard years ago, but I'm not sure if it's good. Hulk Hogan said he was in talks with WWF in early 2001 to come back. But obviously, he came back in 2000. And the idea was he wanted to come back and have a WrestleMania match with Triple H. But Hulk Hogan's knee was really bad at the time. He needed surgery and he couldn't do it. Now, since it's come from Hulk Hogan's mouth, I've kind of just been trained over the years to assume anything Hulk Hogan says is false. I mean, if Hulk Hogan said the sky was blue, I'd look out the window and have a look just to make sure he was telling the truth. So I don't really believe that one. And now, obviously, that ties into something else now. The Undertaker's original match wasn't Triple H. But what it looks like, it was going to be Undertaker and Kane versus Rikishi and Haku. And if you watched the shows at the time, they were sort of building to something like that. And then Rikishi ends up getting injured. So now the Undertaker needs an opponent. Triple H needs an opponent. So it was like, okay, let's just do Triple H and the Undertaker then. Why the hell not? And it did sort of turn out for the better. So that then turned into Triple H versus the Undertaker. But there's more. There's more to this story. This match was also allegedly supposed to involve Shawn Michaels doing a run-in, getting involved in the match, and that in turn was going to limit. The idea was maybe that was going to result in Shawn Michaels coming back to the ring like he did in 2002. So essentially, Shawn Michaels' 2002 comeback was talked about in 2001, but any plans he had for Shawn Michaels for WrestleMania 17 went awry the week before the show, because this was the Raw where it was the same Raw with the last Nitro. Shawn Michaels was at that show, but he was so wasted on pills, passed out in Vince's office and all that, and basically just made a complete tit and embarrassment of himself, to the point where Vince sent him home and just decided he was done with Shawn. After all the shit he'd put up with over the years, he'd had enough. He wasn't doing this anymore. Shawn was sent home. And even Triple H fell out of him. That's how bad it was. Even Triple H fell out with Shawn Michaels at that point, you know. And obviously that led to later on down the line Shawn becoming a born-again Christian and coming back. But it's just also all that stuff's really interesting. And then the only other match that was changed for WrestleMania 17 was it was supposed to be Mick Foley and Vince McMahon in that street fight. So this obviously ties into a big angle at the end of 2000 where Vince fired Mick Foley as a commissioner and all that. So Foley was supposed to come back to the ring to face Vince in the street fight at WrestleMania 7. And Foley's even confirmed this, that he was offered it, but Foley turned it down because I feel like he didn't feel physically up to coming out of retirement just yet to do the Vince match, and turned it down. And that obviously led to Shane replacing Foley in the match. but Mick Foley being the guest referee anyway. And this is a kind of interesting twist to this match. So once it became Vince and Shane, and then they did the whole WCW thing, there was supposed to be a big run in that match, because if you remember, a few WCW wrestlers were in the skybox at that show. So the crack was, during the course of this street fight, a bunch of WCW wrestlers were going to come down, attack Vince and help Shane win the match. But the story is that on a radio show a couple of days before the show, Shawn Stasiak was on that, and then he blabbed and told the whole plan that they were all planning to run in, and then the WWF management were pissed off with WCW guys for that, and then cut that part out of the match. So that's interesting. Now, WrestleMania 18. Now we've got an interesting one. So this obviously revolves around the big main event. Now, it wasn't supposed to be Hogan versus Rock originally. The original pitch was the big dream match, Steve Austin versus Hollywood Hogan for WrestleMania 18. That was a match that was originally pitched. Hogan versus Austin, the face of the Golden Era, the face of the Attitude Era. The two biggest icons in the history of the business were going to battle it out at WrestleMania. Austin versus Hogan. But politics got in the way. Austin didn't really want to do the match, but I think it really came down to an acceptable finish could not be agreed between the two people, and then that was that. So that changed into Hogan versus The Rock, and that's always got me wondering, if Hogan versus Austin happened, does that mean The Rock was going to face Scott Hall? I mean, I guess so, but I guess it probably would have been. But now we're going to go a few long-term plans. So, the long-term plan was always for Triple H to come back from his quad injury, win the Royal Rumble and win the championship at WrestleMania 18. But once this was going on, this was all planned while Austin was still the top heel in the alliance and all that. So the plan was for Austin to stay the top heel, Triple H to come back, and then we get the big showdown between Triple H and Austin. This was going to be a story based around the end of the two-man power trip and all that. But by the time Triple H came back, so much had changed. Austin was now a babyface. The alliance was gone and all that. I mean, it is kind of crazy to think how much WWF changed from Triple H's quad injury in May of 2001 to when he came back in January 2002. So at that point, I think they wanted Triple H to beat the heel at WrestleMania, so they kept the title on Chris Jericho. Now, another one I've heard, a long-term plan, was for basically do Austin versus The Rock again for WrestleMania 18. And I have to believe that. I have to believe if the NWO were not signed, if Hogan didn't come back, would have been Austin versus The Rock at WrestleMania. In the main event, maybe not, because I guess they were dead set on having Triple H triumphing over Chris Jericho and all that. I mean, it stands to reason if Hogan versus Rock wasn't the WrestleMania main event, Austin versus The Rock probably wouldn't have been as well. But I do honestly feel like this match would have happened at WrestleMania 18 had it not been, had Hogan and them not come in. Because what else was he? I mean, what else was he really, to be fair? So that's an interesting one. Now this is the one I heard very, very recently, last year. If it wasn't going to be Ric Flair versus The Undertaker, it was going to be it was going to be Undertaker versus RVD. Undertaker said in 2002, Vince gave him a choice. You can either work with Ric Flair or you can work with RVD. And Undertaker, of course, picked Ric Flair because that was a much cooler feud. He thought, well, I can wrestle RVD. Lots of times we can do that later on. I really want to do the feud with Flair. So that would have been kind of interesting, Undertaker versus RVD. But of course, Flair versus Taker was the much bigger match, the much bigger story and all that. And Taker and RVD did wrestle a bunch of times after that. Now, the big one, another big one, is Hogan and Flair were not the only big WCW stars that were supposed to be on this WrestleMania. The other big WCW star was, in fact, Sting. Sting was talking to the WWF after his Time Warner contract expired in late 2001, and the talks got serious to the point where the creative team were told to come up with some scenarios for Sting for WrestleMania 18, and the big one they came up with was a big match between Kurt Angle versus Sting. And yeah, that would have been a really big WrestleMania match. However, WWF and Sting just couldn't come to the agreement. I think what it came down to was Sting just wasn't willing to work that full-time WrestleMania schedule at that point. I think that's basically what it comes down to. Sting was not willing to do the WrestleMania schedule because at the time, WWF didn't really cater to part-timers the way they do now. I mean, if this happened now, it probably would have happened. Like, they probably would have catered and let Sting do his 4 or 5 matches, big matches of the year. But they didn't really do that back then. So that's why if you think the Kurt Angle's Kane match was a bit random, that's because it was. That's exactly why it was. It was a randomly put together match. It's that simple. Yeah, so obviously that was off the table, and Sting didn't come to WWF for another 12 years after that. Now another two that are kind of interesting. So I think the obvious one is Kevin Nash was Scott Hall's backup. So in the likely event that Scott Hall fucked up and got wasted and had to be fired or whatever, Kevin Nash would have just basically replaced Scott Hall in the match with Austin. That's why Nash didn't have a match at WrestleMania 18, and he was in Scott Hall's corner, just as emergency backup really, in case Scott Hall fell off the wagon again, which he didn't do until the infamous plane ride from hell a couple of months later. But yeah, so it would have been that simple. If Scott Hall had fucked up, it would have been Austin versus Nash. Now a very interesting one. There was another legend that they wanted to be part of WrestleMania 18, and that was Bret Hart. Remember, this show was in Toronto in Canada, and the WWF asked Bret Hart if he would come back and be a guest referee. He doesn't, when Bret was talking about it, he doesn't specify what match he's talking about, but I'm under the impression they're talking about the Triple H Jericho match. So Bret Hart was asked to come back and be a special referee, and he turned it down. That's simple. There's no big story here. Bret was asked, and Bret declined. He didn't want to do it. He wasn't in that place to come back yet, and obviously didn't come back for several years after that. And then one more match to talk about is just a really simple one. The Edge and William Regal, that rivalry was supposed to culminate at WrestleMania 18. Edge was going to win back the Intercontinental title in his hometown, Toronto, but the feud just, I think by the time No Way Out came round, the feud just lost steam, and there wasn't really much fan interest in this feud going on any longer. And after that, things changed. And I'm kind of guessing now, knowing what I know now, because Undertaker had turned down the RVD match. They needed something for RVD to do at WrestleMania, so they decided to put RVD over Regal at WrestleMania. And then that led to Edge and Booker T fighting over fucking Japanese shampoo. Yeah. So now we go to WrestleMania 19, and not a lot here, but there's a couple of interesting ones. And this is another backup one, really. So, remember when Kurt Angle broke his neck right before WrestleMania 19? Originally, Angle was supposed to... Because do you remember that... do you remember when they did that short match between Angle and Lesnar on SmackDown, where Angle did the switcheroo for his brother Eric? That originally was going to be Kurt Angle getting written off, so Angle was going to drop the title to Brock Lesnar in a short match and then get his surgery. However, right before that, Kurt Angle decided, he made the decision to delay his surgery until after WrestleMania, because he desperately wanted to do this WrestleMania match with Brock Lesnar. And you got to think these days, I've got to think these days WWE would not have let him do this. I think like WWE is just so much more advanced in the medical practices now as they were back then. I just don't think they would have let him. I think they would have not let him do it. So once Angle decided he was going to do the match was back on. However, the backup plan was for Brock Lesnar to defend the title against Chris Benoit. So Benoit was in line to replace Kurt Angle into this match. So Lesnar was going to win the title on SmackDown, and that was then going to lead to Lesnar versus Benoit as a WrestleMania title match. I'm got to think that wouldn't have been the main event then. I'm guessing in which case it would have been Austin versus Rock, or even Hogan and Vince would have main evented that WrestleMania. But Angle decided to do the match anyway, and Chris Benoit didn't get his WrestleMania title match until the next year. Now, interesting one. So, originally the idea was for Goldberg to come in and face The Rock at WrestleMania. This is what The Rock wanted to do. The Rock kind of broke the deal with WWE and Goldberg, started negotiations off. But the problem was, WWE and Goldberg didn't come to an agreement to come in until it was too late. So it was too late for Goldberg to come in and have a full build up, then face The Rock, and that's why Goldberg's debut was held off until after WrestleMania, and that's why Goldberg versus Rock was held off to Backlash. But originally they wanted to do Goldberg versus The Rock for WrestleMania 19, That was then going to lead to Austin challenging Triple H for the World Heavyweight title at WrestleMania by all accounts. This is what I believe. The Triple H and Austin were supposed to go for the World Heavyweight title, but then obviously when the Goldberg thing didn't happen, they needed something for The Rock, and then that led to Austin versus Rock 3. Because you got to think, when Austin came back, he wasn't coming back originally to retire. Austin was coming back, but obviously he came back because he was in far worse shape than he's willing to admit. And obviously just all these neck injuries and all that just kind of escalated, and it wasn't decided till very, very late on that Austin was going to retire at that WrestleMania. I think it was a very, very late decision, but so they were going to do Austin versus Rock, and that's why Booker T got the spot. Because if you're thinking, was Booker T just plucked out to try and get this match because he needed an opponent for Triple H? Yeah, because if you watch the show, at no point really was Booker T being groomed for a world title match with Triple H. There wasn't any hints of it, and then he just won that Battle Royal on Raw, and then that was the match. And then, yeah, you know, we don't need to go into that one, do we? Now, one that was on the card, but then was bumped onto Sunday Night Heat the day of the show, and that was for the World Tag Team titles between Lance Storm and Chief Morley versus RVD and Kane. That was announced and all that, had build and everything. And then they decided they wanted to do a silly Miller-like catfight girls segment. But this was the 2000s, and we had silly women's segments like that sometimes. So that got the spot in WrestleMania. And poor RVD, Kane, Lance Storm and Chief Morley, they got bumped onto Sunday Night Heat and had the match there instead, which, yeah, that is what it is. And then an interesting one, not a match, but a segment, because you remember, there was a young rapper on the WWE roster at that time. You might have even heard of him. You might even think he was a Doctor of Thugonomics. That's right, yes. John Cena was in the early stages of his Doctor of Thugonomics character, and he was supposed to have a big rap-off here with Jay-Z and /or Fabulous. Like I said, not really. I knew Jay-Z is, but I couldn't tell you anything about any of his songs or anything like that. And Fabulous, I don't know, he could be literally anyone. But those were the guys you had marked for this big rap battle with John Cena. But the schedule, I think they both had scheduling issues and just either couldn't do it or just didn't want to do it. And then it never happened, but it would have been an interesting one. And the last one really was another late change. So advertised, The Undertaker versus The Big Show on A-Train was supposed to be a tag match involving Nathan Jones. If you've only been watching wrestling for a certain amount of time, you probably don't even know who Nathan Jones is, do you? Nathan Jones was a big, jacked up, 7-foot Australian guy who spent time in prison for armed robbery. Honestly, had a pretty perfect look for wrestling. I mean, honestly, if you don't know who he is, Google Nathan Jones WWE and tell me this guy does not look perfect for a wrestler. The only problem was Nathan Jones was absolutely dreadful in the ring, and as the match wore closer, it became apparent in WWE, we can't do this. We can't put Nathan Jones out there on WrestleMania. This is going to shit the bed. So the decision was made to take Nathan Jones out of the match. They did an angle on Heat where the FBI had attacked Nathan Jones. Then The Undertaker went alone in the handicap match. Although Jones did come out for the finish when he came out and did a spin kick on, I think it was A-Train. I can't remember which one it was now, but he did a spin kick on one of them. And that was that. Now, WrestleMania 20, not a lot of changes. I mean, very, very minimal changes here. So this card was well far out in advance. So apparently there was a plan to do Mark Henry versus Matt Hardy on this show. That's something Matt Hardy claimed several years ago that he was told was going to happen. I just don't know. And then Mark Henry got injured right after the Royal Rumble. And then Matt Hardy was not on this show at all. Now let's talk about notable results. So Lesnar versus Goldberg, that was going to be easy. Lesnar was going to beat Goldberg, and then Goldberg was going to leave the WWE. However, of course, as most people know, Brock Lesnar announced right before the show he was quitting to try and pursue an like a national football dream. And that kind of, so it basically came down to who Vince was less pissed off with. He was less angry at Goldberg for leaving, so he let Goldberg defeat Lesnar on the way out. And then now the main event, I think first it was thought it was going to be Triple H and Chris Benoit, but quite early on they thought maybe this match won't be that interesting, so they added Shawn Michaels to the mix to try and make it a little bit more interesting. And then there was a pitch to do this was going to be a ladder match. They were to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Shawn Michaels Razor Ramon ladder match at WrestleMania 10, also in Madison Square Garden. But then they thought, nah, we'd rather just do a normal match with Benoit winning by pin or submission. So yeah, they basically decided not to do a ladder match, and then you went to just a straight up triple threat match between Benoit, Shawn, and Triple H. Now there's a few interesting ones for WrestleMania 21. Big one revolving around the main event was not supposed to be Batista in there with Triple H. Long-term plan was for Randy Orton and Triple H to have the big showdown for the World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania. So this was essentially going to be the same story of Triple H and Batista. We were just going to be Randy Orton in there. However, in 2004, WWE made the premature decision to rush Randy Orton to the world title anyway, and let's face it, they completely botched his babyface turn. That just flopped so badly, and then by the time we were coming into late 2004, early 2005, fans had just completely lost interest in Orton. But at the same time, Batista just got over. It's honestly, it's kind of weird to think about. Yeah, I don't think people understand how quickly things changed for Batista. He went from basically being the muscle guy in Evolution to being the hottest babyface in the company within like a month's time. So it was right after Survivor Series that his momentum gained again. And by the time we rolled into January, Batista was the hottest guy in the company. So the decision was then made, okay, we're going to have to go with this now. We're going to have to go with Batista going up against Triple H instead. And then Randy Orton and Triple H had the match at the Royal Rumble. Then Orton ended up turning back heel, and then having the Undertaker feud. And then they were off to the races with Batista and all that. So that ended up going to that. And now we're going to talk about the Undertaker. So long-term plans apparently were for Undertaker and Kurt Angle to wrestle on this show. I remember hearing this all the way back in 2004, that they were going to keep them apart, and then in 2005, they were going to start the rivalry, and that was going to have a big WrestleMania match, because Undertaker desperately wanted to have a show-stealing WrestleMania match, which he never had in his career at that point, and he figured Kurt Angle was a guy. And we'll get back to this one in a minute. We'll come back to this later on, but I think plans changed when they decided to go with They decided to go with the big inter-brand match of Kurt Angle and Shawn Michaels. And then there was another plan for The Undertaker. And my God, we've had some stinker matches in the streak. And this would have definitely been in that stinker category. So it was originally thought it might be Undertaker and Kane in a tag team match against John Heidenreich and Gene Snitsky. And this is backed up because in early 2005, Kane was feuding with Snitsky, Undertaker was feuding with Heidenreich, and then they even planted the seed for it in that casket match between Undertaker and Heidenreich. Snitsky ran at that match, tried to help Heidenreich. Kane came out of the casket to help the Undertaker. It was a thought, okay, they're going to do a tag match, but I think at some point they realised, yeah, this was going to suck ass. This was going to shit the bed, and they obviously changed course. And I think the whole Randy Orton thing helped as well, because Randy Orton needed an opponent. They put him for the Undertaker, put Kane the Money in the Bank, and then Heidenreich and Snitsky were not on WrestleMania 20. Well, could you imagine? Honestly, think about it. Could you imagine how bad that match would have been? I honestly think that would be one of the worst streak matches ever. And I mean ever. And now we're going to keep going. Now the very strange rumour, The Rock versus JBL for the WWE Championship. That's right. So long term, they were planning on just keeping the title on JBL. And definitely JBL was going to keep going as WWE Champion into the spring. Possibly even going to go a full year as JBL as WWE Champion. And there was an idea of having him have a big marquee match at WrestleMania. And that was going to be with The Rock. Now, I have heard that The Rock pitched a match with Sting at that year's WrestleMania, but I didn't hear it. Because obviously by 2004, The Rock was, he was Hollywood creep, but obviously WrestleMania was in Hollywood that year, wasn't it? So The Rock still wanted to come back and do his WrestleMania yearly match. But then in a really, really strange situation, The Rock's WWE contract expired at the end of 2004, and WWE didn't even try to renew it. They never reached out to The Rock, they just let his contract expire, and I'm still not sure why they did that, but now The Rock was no longer in WWE. It seemed they weren't interested in bringing him back. That all changed, and that led to them just saying, fuck it, going with John Cena. Pretty smart decision, really, when you look at the history of WWE over the last several years. John Cena then beat JBL to become the guy for the next 10 years after that. But that one's an interesting one. What have we got now? Okay, WrestleMania 22. There's quite a lot for this one. Well, not a lot, but a decent amount. And obviously, let's just go straight to the chase. The big one, Shawn Michaels versus Eddie Guerrero, supposed to have a big showdown at that WrestleMania 22. I don't think this was set in stone, like, yes, this is 100% going to happen. We are definitely going to do this. But they were at least considering it at that point. So I think the plan was they were going to do something with Michaels and Guerrero Survivor Series, and then they were going to see how that escalates with the idea of them blowing up in 2006 and having the big WrestleMania match. And my God, I honestly think, from a match quality standpoint, this is probably the best WrestleMania match we never got. Like, I honestly think this match would have been amazing. I honestly do. Like, Michaels Guerrero, that in itself is a big dream match. But to do it at a WrestleMania setting with a big storyline and a big build-up, wow. Yeah, I think that would have been amazing. And, well, obviously we know why that didn't happen. Eddie Guerrero passed away in November 2005, and, well, that was that, really, wasn't it? Now another one is not a match as such, but they wanted Bret Hart to be involved in WrestleMania 22. They wanted Bret to get involved in the Vince Shawn match. Now, I'm not sure if this would have been as a guest. I'm led to believe it was another guest referee capacity, or an outside enforcer, or something along those lines, or to be even maybe in someone's corner. I'm not sure the exact details, but they definitely wanted Bret for that WrestleMania, because that was obviously Bret and WWE had reconciled somewhat at this point. Obviously the Bret Hart DVD came out in 2005. He was in the Hall of Fame the night before. But again, I just think it's a case of Bret not really being ready to let it all go. But he still harbored a lot of resentment towards Shawn Michaels at this point, and it still took him a little while longer to get over it, and then didn't come back for another 4 years. But in hindsight, he probably should have come back here. So I believe Shawn and Vince was always going to happen. It's just Bret was also going to be involved in this one somehow. Now, let's go back a few years ago. Were we going to get the Austin Hogan match that was going to happen at WrestleMania 8? Was that going to happen 4 years later at WrestleMania 22? So yeah, I think this was definitely at least discussed. This was definitely not set in stone or anything like that. It wasn't like, yeah, this is going to happen. But if you remember Raw Homecoming, there was definitely a seed planted there, because Hulk Hogan did a promo where he talked about he talked about a desire to have a match with Stone Cold Steve Austin at some point. So discussions were at least happening. Hogan versus Austin. Then I think it just never came to be, because I think Austin had another falling out with WWE in late 2005. I think what people don't forget, Austin was actually supposed to come out of retirement to face Coach Taboo Tuesday 2005. But this was the whole, remember they fired Jim Ross again. So yeah, this is another, let's embarrass and humiliate Jim Ross again, because why the hell not? Pal. Then that obviously led to, like, so Austin was supposed to get beat off Coachman. Obviously not clean or anything like that, but he was supposed to lose the match. And Austin was like, are you fucking shitting me? You're wasting me comeback and getting beat by the coach. So Austin, obviously Austin and WWE fell out again. And then it just never came to be. Would this match have been good? Probably not, but I think it would have been entertaining spectacle, and it would have drawn. I'm certain of that. I'm certain it would have drawn for sure. Because if you remember the Hall of Fame, fans were chanting Hogan versus Austin, because Austin did a great burn when because he was inducting Bret, and on the same day Hogan was inducting Mean Gene Okerlund, and he talked about he couldn't find something, and he found a can of whoop-ass with Hulk Hogan's name on it, and it got a huge response. And I'm just thinking, oh, if they'd have done this, it would have been a great spectacle. And now we're going to go with pretty much all the SmackDown side of things. And the original plan for WrestleMania 22 World Heavyweight title match was Batista defending the belt against Randy Orton. So if Batista hadn't got hurt again in January, he was planning to go into WrestleMania 22 as a year-long champion and face Randy Orton. And that would have made a lot of sense, because obviously Evolution member versus Evolution member, Batista the top face on SmackDown, Orton the top heel on SmackDown. It would have been a natural rivalry, and it probably would have been a really good match as well. But of course, Batista got injured, and obviously that led to him losing the World Heavyweight title, because then Kurt Angle. And so now, was Kurt Angle supposed to face The Undertaker at this WrestleMania? Apparently, according to Kurt Angle, yes. He said that Undertaker went to Vince, presented the idea of Angle versus Undertaker at WrestleMania, and Undertaker even offered to lose the streak to Kurt Angle. Because I think Undertaker just had a deep desire to have a WrestleMania match with Kurt Angle, and even offered to put the streak up against it, but Vince said no, because I think Vince was because they did have this match at No Way Out, didn't they? But I'm thinking if Batista hadn't got hurt, Angle would have stayed on Raw, so they still could have done it as a Raw versus SmackDown match, because why the hell not? It would have been awesome. I mean, then obviously happened at No Way Out instead, because I think for some reason Vince was just fixated on putting Mark Henry with The Undertaker, because this was yet another attempt to get Mark Henry over, and they wanted to give Mark Henry a big match with The Undertaker, and that's what ended up happening. Angle defended the World Heavyweight title against Randy Orton instead. And now, speaking of Mark Henry versus The Undertaker, what if I told you at one point Vince was toying with the idea of having Mark Henry end the streak? That's right, on a Bruce Pritchard podcast, he said that originally Vince was thinking about having Mark Henry end the streak, and when The Undertaker presented with this idea, Undertaker said words to the effect as well, I don't really think we should do that, but if that's what Vince really wants me to do, I'll do it. So Undertaker decided if Vince really wanted him to lose to Mark Henry, he would have done it. But then I think Vince changed his mind again, decided no, Mark Henry doesn't need to end the streak, and Undertaker ended up winning that match. So that would be a weird one if it was Mark Henry and not Brock Lesnar who ended the streak, wouldn't it? That would be very, very strange. And then an interesting one I've heard a few years ago, there was another idea for an opponent for The Undertaker, and it was not someone inside the WWE. What if I told you it was a TNA wrestler? And what if I told you that man's name was Abyss? So Abyss has said this in the past that, and I don't think he specifically said WrestleMania 22, but that's that's the impression I'm getting, that year WWE offered Abyss a contract to come in and have a WrestleMania match with The Undertaker. Now, Tommy Dreamer previously said this was for 2003 for WrestleMania 19, but that timeline does not make sense, because in early 2003 Abyss wasn't even Abyss yet, so there would have been no reason to bring him in and face The Undertaker in 2003, because he was pretty much, I think was he still Eric Justice at that point, so he was still pretty much a nobody. But Abyss felt some loyalty towards TNA and decided to turn the match down, and if that's true, then I think he deserves a lot of credit for being loyal, perhaps even loyal to a fault, really, if you think about it, because if you think anyone in that TNA roster at that time who seemed primed and ready to go to WWE and be successful would have been Abyss, right? And I think Abyss versus Undertaker would have been a hell of a lot better than Undertaker versus Mark Henry was, I'm being honest with you, so that's an interesting one. Right, and let's go to WrestleMania 23. And this one revolves around the main event. And the main event, of course, was John Cena versus Shawn Michaels. But originally, it was going to be the rematch from WrestleMania 22 with John Cena facing Triple H for the WWE Championship. But this one is definitely true, because Triple H has confirmed this. But Triple H tore his quad at New Year's Revolution. And then they needed a new opponent for John Cena. And then the easiest solution was to have Triple H's DX buddy, Shawn Michaels, Mr. WrestleMania, in there. And I'm not going to say I'm glad Triple H got injured, because that's a harsh thing to say. But I will say, I think I enjoyed Cena versus Shawn Michaels a lot more than I would have enjoyed Cena versus Triple H. Don't get me wrong, Cena Triple H probably would have been very good, probably even great. I think it would have been better than the WrestleMania 22 match because John Cena had grown so much as a performer in the last year. And I've got to wonder, would Triple H have gone over this time? I've got to think he would, you know. Because I just don't see Triple H dropping 2 consecutive WrestleMania main events to John Cena. Especially when he'd already lost at WrestleMania 20 and WrestleMania 21. So he'd lost 3 WrestleMania main events in a row. So would he have lost a 4th? I don't think he would, you know. But then, so also, the Battle of the Billionaires, that was always going to happen, the McMahon-Trump storyline. That was slated for quite a while. But it was not Bobby Lashley and Umaga originally slated in the match. Oh no, it was going to be Shawn Michaels representing Donald Trump, yes. And then King Booker representing Mr. McMahon. So I think what happened was, when John Cena needed an opponent, and they went with Shawn Michaels, then they thought, then they probably thought Lashley versus King Booker wasn't really a fresh match. So they obviously they put Lashley with Trump, and then they replaced Booker with Umaga, and then Booker went into the Money in the Bank ladder match. I've got to think though, if things had worked out that way, Michaels and Booker would have been actually a nice gem of a match. If I'm not mistaken, that would have been the only ever match between Shawn Michaels and Booker T. I don't think they've ever wrestled before. Possibly on television, maybe once, but I cannot instantly recall it. Certainly not on pay-per-view. I know for certain they never ever had a pay-per-view match. And you got to think both guys were on the same roster for quite a long time and never had a big singles match. That's kind of interesting. This probably would have been one of the best matches of Booker T's career, quite frankly. Maybe not the level of some of his WCW matches with Chris Benoit, but certainly, I would say definitely probably his best match in WWE for sure. So yeah, that's quite interesting. Then another big one. So this is more of a long-term plan. But in 2006, obviously when we were getting close to the show, big plans were made because what was WrestleMania 23? The 20th anniversary of one of the most legendary WrestleManias of all time, WrestleMania 3. And it was in Detroit as well. So, WWE were looking to capitalise on that, doing a new Hogan versus Andre by having Hulk Hogan take on the Big Show in a... It would have been exactly that. It's basically a tribute to Hogan versus Andre. But obviously they couldn't get Andre anymore because he was dead. Hogan was still somewhat active. And yeah, they were going for that, Hogan versus the Big Show. They were building towards that, and that was going to be the big match at WrestleMania. Then things obviously changed along the way, because by late 2006, Big Show was, I think he was just so hurt. He had bad knees, he had bad back, he was just generally in poor shape, and decided to leave the WWE when his contract expired at the end of 2006. He took like a whole year off and didn't come back till early 2008. So, Big Show leaving WWE, this plan is off the table. Then I'm not sure what happened with Hogan. Because I know Hogan and Vince had a falling out around early 2007. But I can't exactly remember why. Maybe it was a money thing, maybe something like that. But then, obviously, Hogan ended up not being at WrestleMania at all. I mean, I suppose he could have done Hogan versus Khali, but my God, how terrible would that be? So Hogan wasn't on WrestleMania 23 at all. Then just a couple of little ones. Edge versus Randy Orton. I've always heard that was going to happen on this show, but instead both men were putting Money in the Bank. I think Edge was injured. I'm pretty sure Edge was carrying an injury, and that's why he was putting Money in the Bank. And more importantly, that's why Edge was taking out that Money in the Bank halfway through. If you remember, Jeff Hardy did that amazing leg drop spot off the ladder, threw Edge onto a ladder that was propped on the guardrail in the ring. I think that's the reason why, and it's just a shame because that would have been a nice little WrestleMania match, wouldn't it? Then the other one, which I actually thought would have been a neat mid-card match, which never ended up happening, was Carlito versus Ric Flair. Also heard that was slated for WrestleMania 23. They had a neat little storyline going at the time, and yet it just never happened. And instead, they were both on the kickoff show with Ric Flair and Carlito taking on SmackDown's Gregory Helms and Chavo Guerrero in a basically a nothing match, and that's a shame. And the Flair Carlito singles match didn't happen until Judgment Day 2 months later. So not a lot there, but a couple of ones. Now, WrestleMania 24. Now, a couple of big ones here, really. I mean, the main one is just a slight modification of the huge Mayweather Big Show showdown. That was like the big mainstream celebrity match for WrestleMania that year. But what if I told you it wasn't supposed to be a singles match at all? So, obviously Mayweather was supposed to come in. Big Show's always coming back. But what if I told you they were going to be tag team partners instead of opponents? That is right. The original plan was for Big Show and Mayweather to be a heel tag team, taking on the team of Rey Mysterio and Batista. And that makes obvious sense because a tag match there would have been less pressure on Mayweather to deliver when you've got 3 experienced wrestlers in there. And I feel like having Mayweather do some spots with Rey Mysterio would have made a lot more sense because of the size comparison and all that. But Mysterio got hurt right before No Way Out because he was supposed to face Edge on that show, and if you remember, they had to really basically cut down that match and have a short, safe match. And then with that, it turned out, for some reason they didn't come up with another partner for Batista, which they possibly could have done, but I'm not sure who they could have come up with. And then I suppose they just decided to go for the angle of the biggest versus the best. Obviously the best fight in the world, Floyd Mayweather, the world's largest athlete, the Big Show. I kind of think it turned out better, to be honest with you. But yeah, that was the original idea, a tag match. Then a notable result that revolves around Money in the Bank. CM Punk was not supposed to win Money in the Bank that year. The Money in the Bank winner was supposed to be Jeff Hardy. Obviously Jeff Hardy was already announced for the match and all that. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was the first person to qualify for that Money in the Bank ladder match, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, it was going to be an 8-man ladder match with Hardy, Punk, Jericho, Carlito, Shelton Benjamin, John Morrison. Who else was in there? Mr. Kennedy and MVP. And then a few weeks out before WrestleMania, Jeff Hardy gets busted for a drug test. This was his second violation of the wellness policy, and then he was gone from the company for 60 days suspension. But interestingly, WWE didn't even bother replacing him. I mean, they could have put someone else in there, but they just went with a 7-man Money in the Bank ladder match instead. But yeah, if you remember, this is when Jeff Hardy was getting super hot. I mean, he got really hot around the end of 2007 and into 2008. I mean, in the build of that Royal Rumble match with Randy Orton, Jeff Hardy was just so hot. And now he was getting to really be the most popular guy in the roster. And WWE's going to capitalise on that. He was going to win the Money in the Bank ladder match. And the big one I've heard as well, not only was he supposed to win the Money in the Bank that night, if you believe the rumours, he was also supposed to cash in the briefcase that night and become WWE champion. Now, I'm not sure exactly how that would have worked. Would he have done the traditional thing where Orton wins and then Jeff Hardy comes out afterwards and beats a weakened Orton? Or would the match about to start and then Jeff Hardy would have come out, cashed in Money in the Bank and made that a fatal 4-way and then won? That I'm not too clear on, but I have definitely heard that one over the years. Now, this one comes from Hulk Hogan's mouth, so gotta take it as one with a pinch of salt. Hulk Hogan has said that WWE offered him, there was in talks that would do John Cena versus Hulk Hogan on this show. Obviously that kind of makes sense because it was in Orlando, not far from where Hogan lives and all that. And by 2008, Hogan was still somewhat mobile, I think. Yeah, and obviously, I think the window for these two clash was very small because Cena was rising as a major superstar right as Hulk Hogan was ending his career. And this would have been a decent match, I feel. But I think the crack was Hulk Hogan's back injuries flared up when Hulk Hogan couldn't do the match. Now, I'm leaning on this one being false, to be honest with you, because, like I say, it's just Hulk Hogan, isn't it? You know what I mean? And then this is a really interesting one. So, a big match would have been Triple H versus Mr. Kennedy for control of the WWE. Does that confuse you? So let me explain. So this goes quite a ways back to like mid to autumn of 2007. So if you remember, right before the Chris Benoit tragedy, Vince McMahon did a storyline where his limousine blew up and they presumed he was dead. Now that was going to lead to weeks and weeks of speculation, and then it was going to find out that Vince had faked his own death, and he'd did it with the help of Mr. Kennedy, and that was because Mr. Kennedy was Vince's illegitimate son. Vince had an affair at some point, and that turned out that the woman that Vince had an affair with had Mr. Kennedy, Ken Kennedy, and Kennedy was Vince's son. But with the whole Chris Benoit tragedy, Vince had to drop the fake death aspect of this storyline. But not to worry, the next storyline that came up was someone had found out that Vince did have an illegitimate child, and he was on the WWE roster. I mean, just imagine that. Imagine the odds of having an illegitimate child, and then 30 years later that child works for you in your company. But yeah, then this went on for weeks and weeks, didn't it? We were going to find out who Vince's illegitimate son was, and that son was going to be Mr. Kennedy. That was going to be the big reveal, and that was going to lead to Kennedy getting a mega push. And what was going to happen there, Kennedy was going to be Vince's son, and that was supposed to lead to Triple H finally coming out and admitting on television that he was married to Stephanie. Because if you remember, prior to that, they'd never acknowledged in kayfabe that Triple H and Stephanie were married. It was always done as a wink, nudge type of thing. And of course, in 2009, for the build-up of the Randy Orton match, the fact that Triple H was married at the McMahon family was revealed finally after all this time. But that was going to happen a year earlier. So that was going to lead to Triple H and Kennedy feuding for the McMahon family pride and all that. So obviously Vince sided with Mr. Kennedy, Stephanie siding with Triple H and all that. And that was going to lead to a big showdown, probably at WrestleMania 24 for control of the company. That would have been a cool storyline. But then what happened was, right before the reveal happened, a big signature pharmacy scandal broke out where the WWE found out a bunch of names of wrestlers that had been illegally buying steroids from a online pharmacy, and all the people involved in this ended up getting suspended, and one of those guys is Mr. Kennedy. And that really ruined his career in hindsight, really, didn't it? I mean, he'd had a couple of bad breaks before injuries, but this was a big one. This reveal was going to take Kennedy to that next level, and then eventually it came back, but it was never ever the same. Oh God! And then that ended up being hornswoggled. We don't need to get into that one. So the whole thing was just dropped entirely, and then the whole thing just never happened. But it would have been quite interesting. Now, WrestleMania 25. I think now the big one really revolves around Chris Jericho versus the Legends match. Obviously in real life, it's going to be Chris Jericho versus Roddy Piper, Jimmy Snuka and Ricky Steamboat, Ric Flair in the corner. Jericho's doing the whole Legends bashing thing. But that all started off with the idea that the Chris Jericho is going to wrestle Mickey Rourke as Randy the Ram Robinson. So the wrestler came out in late 2008 to pretty great acclaim. Apparently at first Vince didn't like the movie and all that, but I guess when he thought like this became quite a big deal, and Mickey Rourke became quite a big star out of this again, Vince decided to try and take advantage of that, and then he booked the big celebrity match for WrestleMania. Chris Jericho was going to face Mickey Rourke under the Randy the Ram Robinson character, and that was going to happen at WrestleMania, and it probably would have been a reasonable match, you know. But what happened was Mickey Rourke blabbed about it too early before WWE had a chance to like really start the build up and announce the match. So I think I was on a mainstream interview that Mickey Rourke called out Chris Jericho for WrestleMania, and then because at the time Mickey Rourke was up for an Oscar for that performance in The Wrestler. I mean, honestly, if you've never seen that movie, you have to watch it. I mean, if you really are a wrestling fan, you've got to watch that movie. So Mickey Rourke was actually up for an Oscar at the time because his performance as Randy the Ram was so good. But then Mickey Rourke's advisors and all that freaked out, thinking, oh, if you're going to associate himself with WWE, that was going to hurt his Oscar chances. So Mickey Rourke's advisors advised Mickey Rourke to pull out the match, and that's what he did. So Mickey Rourke pulled out the match, but so they still wanted Chris Jericho to do something along the lines of bashing Legends for WrestleMania. So then we got the Chris Jericho versus the Legends in the handicap match at WrestleMania, and there's even a little twist here as well. It was not actually Ricky Steamboat was not the original guy pitched for this one. So when this storyline came up, there had to be two rules. One, they had to be a WWE Hall of Famer, and two, they had to be involved in the first WrestleMania. But now, so the names in win for it were Roddy Piper, Jimmy Snuka, Greg the Hammer Valentine. Right, that would have been but Chris Jericho really wanted to do something with Steamboat, so he asked for Ricky Steamboat, because I think they knew at that point Ricky Steamboat was going to the 2009 Hall of Fame. So by the time WrestleMania came around the following night, he would have qualified. And then apparently what they asked was, do they own his name? Because when Ricky Steamboat got divorced several years earlier, apparently his wife took the Ricky Steamboat name and all that and won that, so they had to make sure that Ricky Steamboat could get his name back and trademark so they could use Ricky Steamboat. So then, once that was all cleared up, Valentine was out, Steamboat was in, and let's face it, Steamboat being there made that match. Honestly, I really loved that Ricky Steamboat performance. I honestly really loved that Ricky Steamboat 2009 comeback. As brief as it was pretty damn cool. So yeah, and then just a couple of minor change for this one. I think the World Heavyweight title match was going to be John Cena vs Edge in the singles match. But at some point along the way, someone decided they wanted to add the Big Show at that match. And I'll be honest with you, I feel like that should have just been Cena vs Edge. I don't think the Big Show needed to be in that one at all. So there's that. And then there was going to be a big change at the Royal Rumble 2009. It wasn't supposed to be Jeff versus Matt. Matt wasn't supposed to be the one to turn heel. It was supposed to be a returning Christian. Christian was, because obviously Christian had signed back in WWE from TNA, and he was coming back. And this is what was going to go down. It was going to be Christian that was revealed as the mystery attacker of Jeff Hardy. And that was going to lead to a big feud between them two. But last minute, for whatever reason, Vince just decided to change his mind. The rumour at the time was that Vince felt that too many people knew about it on the internet and all that, which I'm not sure if that's the case or not. But whatever the reason are, Vince changed his mind and then decided to go for Matt turning heel on Jeff. So if Christian had been the attacker, it was going to be one or two matches. I think it was either going to be Jeff Hardy versus Christian singles match, or possibly it could have been Edge and Christian versus the Hardys, which that would have been pretty interesting for me, a long-time fan like me, seeing that one. That would have been quite cool. But yeah, I really do think that should have been Christian, but then obviously when the Matt turn happened, ended up being Jeff versus Matt. And then Christian ended up just coming back on ECW. And then a simple one here really. Trish was supposed to return for that missed WrestleMania Battle Royal. No need to go into big detail there. She was supposed to return. She turned it down. She wasn't in the match. Who cares? Now this one, now I think the long-term plan was for John Cena versus Batista to have their World Heavyweight title match at WrestleMania 25. And they were going to have a big rematch of SummerSlam, although this time it was going to have a pretty big build. Not sure if Batista was supposed to turn heel in this one. I'm going to assume he would have done, but I'm not certain about that. So basically this Cena Batista match for the world title was just delayed a year later and happened at WrestleMania 26. And then just basically, originally on the card was John Morrison and The Miz versus Carlito and Primo Colon. But last minute that got bumped to the kickoff show. I believe in those days it was just on WWE.com. It's not kind of like it is now, where it was on all these platforms and all that. But the last minute they wanted Kid Rock to do a little mini concert. Oh God. A little mini concert right before the Divas Battle Royal. So unfortunately, the Miz and Morrison versus Carlito and Primo was bumped to the kickoff show. And now this one's quite significant, really. It's not a change in the match or anything like that, or even the result. But the crack was Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels was originally slated for 15 minutes. Yeah, that's right. It was supposed to be a 15-minute match. This one I got from the referee for that match, Marty Elias, was on Talk Is Jericho a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, something like that. Yeah, and he discussed it. But when I heard that story, I remember being familiar with it. So I've heard this one before, but I can't remember what the original source was. Because when Marty Elias talked about this, I was familiar with that story, so I'd heard it before, but I can't remember why. So basically, he was talking about how Shawn and Taker were in a ring working out the match, and then they realised pretty quickly, hang on, we can't do this in 15 minutes. We need a lot more time, and because obviously this happens quite often, but because Shawn Michaels and Undertaker had significant pull, they managed to get the thing changed, and then they double the time, have 30 minutes. And just imagine this match, one of the greatest matches of all time. I mean, it's got to be in everyone's top 5 WrestleMania matches of sure, right? It has to be. So just imagine if this match had only got 15 minutes. I mean, it would have been nowhere near as good, would it? It would have nowhere near the legacy it would have had, and it wouldn't. Maybe it would have led to all the other things that happened after that. So that one's I just find a little bit interesting. There we go to WrestleMania 36. So a couple of interesting ones here. So first rumour I heard, but I'm not sure if it's true or not, is they were looking to do Cena versus Undertaker for Undertaker's streak in this match. Because the rumour was at the time, if you remember, that triple threat tag team match on Raw and MSG was Cena versus Undertaker versus DX versus Chris Jericho and the Big Show. And post match, Taker had laid out Cena with a tombstone, and people then were speculating this was supposed to build to a WrestleMania match, but that never happened. Now, this is where it takes a really interesting twist. So, Shawn Michaels revealed a number of years ago the original plan for WrestleMania was not him versus The Undertaker. So in late 2009, Vince had the idea that he wanted to do a youth movement, he wanted to create stars, and he had 3 big young stars in mind for WrestleMania matches against legends. So 3 matches were supposed to happen as a result of this. Number 1, Triple H versus Sheamus, which did happen. And then 2 hugely significant matches. Shawn Michaels was supposed to go one-on-one with The Miz. Yeah, imagine that. So obviously The Miz was a US champion at the time. He was doing really good. So this is when The Miz was really starting to break out and become a superstar. And of course, the following year would be WWE champion. So Vince had it in mind that Shawn Michaels was going to get that great match out of The Miz. Miz was going to face Mr. WrestleMania. And although that probably would have been a pretty good match, it wouldn't have been Undertaker versus HBK, would it? So who the hell was Undertaker going to face? Drew McIntyre. So yeah, it was going to be Shawn and The Miz, and Undertaker versus Drew McIntyre, and that's a weird one. If it was Drew McIntyre now, this probably would have been pretty damn great, but this was a quite green Drew McIntyre of early 2010. Let's just face it, Drew just was not ready for that push he got at the time, and the match with Undertaker probably wouldn't have been all that. It probably would have been alright. It definitely would have been a lot better than some of the streak matches over the years past, but yeah, just the excitement just would not be there, would it? And then things changed. Then they decided they were just going to do Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels again at WrestleMania 26, and that was scrapped. So this plans had to have been in place around the time of Survivor Series 2009, because Shawn challenged Undertaker in December 2009. So obviously they'd already decided at that point they were going to change. Now, as far as Drew McIntyre goes, the crack was that apparently he was originally slated to win the Money in the Bank that year instead of Jack Swagger. And that kind of makes sense because they were doing the whole Drew McIntyre Chosen One thing. And the whole story of that Money in the Bank match revolved around Drew McIntyre losing qualifiers, and then Vince keep giving him second and third chances to get in. But apparently, basically, Drew's backstage behaviour and all that, and a little bit of immaturity on his part kind of cost him that thing. Then they went to Swagger instead. Now, just a little simple one here, because 2 matches happened on this show, Bret Hart and Vince McMahon, and Cena versus Batista. So I think at one point there was discussion about turning that into a tag team match, with Bret Hart and John Cena versus Batista and Mr. McMahon. And it sort of looked like they were going in that direction for a little bit when they decided to just go for 2 singles matches. So I think when Bret came back, the whole thing was, what could Bret Hart actually do? I mean, Bret had an issue with his Lloyd's of London policy and all that. So obviously general health, I don't think they were sure what exactly Bret could do and what Bret couldn't do. So there was a thought of making it a tag team match and having Cena and Batista do the bulk of the work. Then Bret and Vince were going to come in for the end of the match, and then Bret was going to put Vince in the sharpshooter and all that. But then that didn't. I don't think that got past the consideration stages, though. It ended up being a 2 singles match anyway. Now, another match that was slightly modified was the Legacy Triple Threat match. First off, it was just going to be Randy Orton versus Ted DiBiase in a singles match. I mean, they teased this way back in like summer of 2009, didn't they? Can't remember exactly what Raw was. This was possibly the Raw with Ted DiBiase Sr. as a host, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And the main one, really, is Randy Orton was still supposed to be the heel, and Ted DiBiase was going to turn babyface and potentially break out. But along the way, it got to the point where, because when they were starting this angle, it was Orton that got a lot more popular, so they just decided to go Orton as a babyface. And I think the feeling was that they hadn't really done a good enough job of building DiBiase up as a threat to Orton, so they thought if they put Cody in there, have Cody and DiBiase as the 2 heels, Randy Orton might be in a little bit more jeopardy if he had 2 heels to face against instead of 1. So then, yeah, that would end up turning the Legacy Triple Threat match. Now, WrestleMania 27. I mean, it's just this really just revolved around the Undertaker Triple H match, and a couple of significant changes to this match. So, the original plans had Undertaker versus Wade Barrett, and this is backed up because if you remember Bragging Rights 2010, they did the storyline where Nexus attacked the Undertaker, cost him the Buried Alive match with Kane. So that was going to later Taker coming back in early 2011, going after the Nexus and going after Wade Barrett at WrestleMania. But let's just face it, we don't need to go down this rabbit hole again, but Cena had pretty much fucked the Nexus up by that point, and by the time we got into early 2011, Barrett had completely cooled off. And then, do you remember that lame angle where CM Punk took over the Nexus, and then Wade Barrett and Justin Gabriel, Heath Slater and those guys formed the core of Ezekiel Jackson? Yeah, that just wasn't very good, was it? So by the time we got into 2011, it was obvious Barrett wasn't going to happen. And then these would have been massive. So, the interesting one, hot rumour at the time in late 2010 was WWE wanted to bring UFC star Brock Lesnar in to face The Undertaker at WrestleMania. Because if you remember when Brock Lesnar had that fight with Cain Velasquez, and Cain Velasquez beat the shit out of Brock Lesnar, Undertaker was in the crowd and did an interview with, what's his face, Ariel Helwani or whatever you call him. I kind of know what about here. Then they did a thing where Undertaker got into Brock Lesnar's face, and that was on WWE and Undertaker's part a ploy to get some attention on there to try and build something to maybe have Brock Lesnar come in. I mean, talks happened, but it basically come down to Dana White was not going to let Brock Lesnar do it, because in fairness, why would he? If Brock Lesnar, a UFC superstar, why would Dana White want to risk one of his most bankable stars in Brock Lesnar doing a wrestling match, and A, potentially getting hurt and fucking up his fighting career, and B, if Lesnar loses a worked wrestling match, what does that do for Lesnar's value in UFC? So it never happened, and of course never happened for 3 more years. One thing I'm not certain about, would the streak have ended 3 years earlier if this has all come off? I don't know. Obviously what we do know is Lesnar retired from UFC about a year later and came back in 2012, and then 2 years after this broke the streak. So Lesnar vs Undertaker could have happened 3 years earlier. And then the big one, the one you're waiting for. This WrestleMania could have hosted one of the biggest rematches of all time. One of the biggest matches that have never ever happened. One of the biggest ultimate WWF versus WCW fantasy matches. The idea was Undertaker versus Sting. So at the very least, Sting and WWE had talked about it. They didn't agree a deal or anything, but I think the offer was there for Sting to come in at WrestleMania, have this WrestleMania match with the Undertaker, because it was in Atlanta as well, remember, which of course was a hotbed of WCW for many, many years. At some point in time in late 2010, early 2011, Sting's TNA contract expired, and I remember the speculation being wild at the time, because you know those two The two 21-11 videos that they were building up for weeks with the man in the trench coat. I mean, a lot of people believed those vignettes were for Sting. I remember like lunatics on YouTube doing these long, lengthy videos, looking at all these clues and basically over-analysing every little detail. Yeah, don't worry fans, YouTube wrestling hasn't changed over the last 11 years. But yeah, they were basically doing that, and then some point in time Sting turned it down, decided to re-sign with TNA, and then ended up wrestling a drunk Jeff Hardy. But oh god, yeah, fair play to Sting, like, because he's a very, very loyal guy. He was loyal to WCW for all those years, and he was loyal to TNA. And I've got to think he must regret this now. He has to, right? Because when Sting came into WWE eventually, they never ended up doing the Undertaker match. And this was a big time for it to happen. So, with those out, then that turned into Undertaker versus Triple H. And the original plan for Triple H was simple, really. It was going to be Triple H versus Sheamus. I mean, that's it. Because it was Sheamus sitting on kayfabe injured Triple H at Extreme Rules 2010. So Sheamus is going to come back and then, Triple H is going to come back and get his revenge on Sheamus. Yeah, and now WrestleMania 28. Though this was an interesting story at the time. So obviously the matches were never going to change and all that, but there was going to be a slight direction change to WrestleMania 22. The crack was John Cena was going to win the 2012 Royal Rumble, and then that was going to lead to a big dilemma. Cena had to make a choice at this point. So he was going to either choose to give up his WrestleMania match with The Rock, or he's going to give up his WWE title shot. And I'm glad he didn't do that, to be honest, because I think that would have been lame as shit. Honestly, I just know I would have absolutely hated that storyline if they'd went that direction. But thankfully they didn't, and Sheamus won the Royal Rumble. Now, another one is some slight modification. CM Punk and Chris Jericho was originally going to be a 10-minute brawl, ended in a double DQ. That's right, I think both Jericho and I want to say Punk said this as well. Jericho definitely has talked about it. And I'm pretty sure Punk has too. So, obviously they were doing the whole personal thing with Chris Jericho attacking CM Punk's family and all that good shit. And so that was going to lead to like just breaking out into a huge brawl. And then after 10 minutes it was going to end in a double DQ. Obviously that was just going to lead to the Chicago Street Fight the next month and all that. But I think the feeling was because he'd already decided, then they decided they were going to do the Daniel Bryan Sheamus squash. So they didn't want to have two world title matches, kind of ended in an unsatisfactory way. So, and I think both Jericho and Punk campaigned to get things changed to have a proper lengthy wrestling match instead. And yeah, I just got to think that would have shit. I think that would have shit the bed too. To be fair, I think I would have absolutely hated that one. To be honest with you. Then a couple of changes. So I've heard Randy Orton was supposed to be added to the Bryan Sheamus match to make it a triple threat match. This obviously stems from, because there was that Elimination Chamber where Santino was in it and nearly won it. He was replacing Randy Orton on that one because it was Daniel Bryan in there. I think he kicked Randy Orton in the head, or maybe hit him with a steel chair, I can't remember. One of them two, and that gave Randy Orton a concussion. He missed that Elimination Chamber. So Orton was going to want revenge on Bryan, and then he would have been added into the match with Bryan versus Sheamus. Then another one, thank God this didn't happen, but I think originally it was going to be Mark Henry versus Kane on this show, which that stems from Kane was one of the victims of Mark Henry's Hall of Pain and that. So Kane was going to get revenge on Henry. So yeah, I'm just not sure how that would have worked, because one of them would have had to turn face, and it wouldn't really have made sense to turn Kane back face so quickly after he turns a heel. And I don't think it would have made sense to turn Mark Henry babyface at that time. And let's just face it, the match just wouldn't have been very good. But I think Mark Henry was hurt in early 2012 and only really got added to the Team Teddy vs Team Johnny match quite late. So with Henry out injured, Kane needed an opponent, and then they went to Orton, and that obviously led to just Bryan and Sheamus having this 18-second singles match. Now a couple of interesting ones. I don't know how rude these are probably just internet scuzzles, but I think like long-term plan, WWE really want to do Rey Mysterio versus Sin Cara for this show. Which I think people don't realise what plans WWE had for Sin Cara coming in, because this was Triple H's first major sign as head of developmental, and Sin Cara, aka Mystico, was a massive star in Mexico. Like seriously, he was like a mega superstar, and then he came into WWE with all this hype and all that around him, and then let's just face it, everything that could have went wrong did go wrong. But really, what WWE were looking for was a long-term replacement for him to be the luchador Latin superstar to replace Rey Mysterio. So I think at one point they were really hoping to do this match at WrestleMania, and then I think both guys are injured, weren't they? Mysterio got injured in the summer of 2011, and then Sin Cara got injured at Survivor Series that year. I think there is a possibility this might have been in the works again for WrestleMania 29, but I'm not sure about that one. Now, next one's really a simple one. So this was never actually the plan, but Goldust, aka Dustin Rhodes, was really campaigning for an Intercontinental title match with Cody. At the time, I think Dustin was working with WWE as a road agent at the time. He wasn't in the ring anymore. But I think he really pitched over and over again to do the Cody match at WrestleMania. But Vince and WWE just weren't interested in doing that. As simple as. And also, I think we'll get back to this one in a few minutes. Big Show versus Shaq was originally talked about for this WrestleMania. Shaquille O'Neal. So there was talks about that one happening, and that one fell through. And we'll get back to that one. Just bear with me on that one. Now we've got a WrestleMania 29, and not a lot here really. So the biggest interesting one is a few years ago, The Rock did an interview where The Rock said at one point he was under the impression the main event was going to be a triple threat match with CM Punk versus John Cena versus The Rock. But I saw. So apparently at one point, Rock was either told or was under the impression that the WrestleMania main event was going to be the triple threat match that we all wanted. Or we let's face it, we all wanted CM Punk in that WrestleMania main event. And most of us were disappointed when he wasn't. But I guess fairly early on, WWE decided no, they were going to go twice in a lifetime anyway. Then CM Punk was out. So, interesting one though, a little slight modification again. So, after that, so I'm guessing in January these plans, or late December these plans were drawn up. CM Punk vs The Undertaker was always going to happen at one point, but there's an interesting story out there. CM Punk was slated to retain the WWE Championship at Royal Rumble 2013, and then it was going to be CM Punk versus The Undertaker, streak versus the WWE Championship at WrestleMania 29. We've obviously seen The Rock having the match anyway. It would have just been non-title, and the consideration was for CM Punk versus The Undertaker to have a title versus streak match at WrestleMania. But I'm guessing what happened was they thought Cena versus Rock needed the title more, and I'm guessing they thought, hold on a second, it would have been, we can't really put the WWE title on The Undertaker in 2013, right? And let's face it, CM Punk was never going over The Undertaker. He just wasn't. That was just never in the cards. So that of course just the Undertaker and Punk in a standard streak match. Now, originally, Chris Jericho versus Fandango was not supposed to happen. Chris Jericho was coming back to WWE with the idea that he was going to quickly turn heel in a feud with Ryback and have a big match with Ryback. I guess the thought was, Chris Jericho can give Ryback a really good WrestleMania match and put him over. They can have a really good little angle with him. Then at some point in time, Vince got really high on Fandango. And I think it's one of those, do you know where Vince gets really high on someone for like 5 minutes and then completely loses interest later on? It was one of those ones. I think Vince loved the Fandango character and wanted to give Fandango a big WrestleMania debut. And he did it against Chris Jericho, and Chris Jericho fought this. Chris Jericho hated this idea. Tried so many times to convince Vince to change his mind. Vince said no. Even in desperation, Chris Jericho pitched it Intercontinental title match with Wade Barrett for the Intercontinental title on this show, if the angle being Jericho going for his 10th Intercontinental title. But Vince was adamant. That he wasn't going to change his plans, and then Chris Jericho and Fandango went on like scheduled. Then just a little one at some point. supposed to be Sheamus versus Randy Orton for the World Heavyweight title. So I think in this Big Show rivalry, Sheamus was supposed to get the title back from the Big Show. And then he was going to face Randy Orton one-on-one for the world title at WrestleMania. But that ended up not happening because they ended up going with Alberto Del Rio to beat the Big Show. And then at some point in time they decided they were going to give Jack Swagger another push. And that ended up being Alberto Del Rio versus Jack Swagger. Ugh. That was a kind of really underwhelming match, wasn't it? And then just a simple one, a match that was advertised. So in the same vein of WrestleMania 10, the match was actually cancelled right there and then on the spot. It was supposed to be the Rhodes Scholars, Cody Rhodes and Damien Sandow, teamed up with the Bella Twins to face Brodus Clay, Lord Tensai and the Funkadactyls. That match was announced and all that, had a graphic and all that, had a little storyline going in. And then, so this was either supposed to go on before or after Triple H versus Brock Lesnar. I can't remember exactly which one it was. But it was either before or after. But then, remember this time, this was the last WrestleMania before the network, so they had strict pay-per-view time, and I think they already realised the show was going long, and they needed as much time as they could for Rock versus Cena. So at some point, that's basically what happened. Much like WrestleMania 10, they were like, hold on, we don't have time for this tag match, and right before there and then on the show, the match was cancelled, and that's got to suck for those guys, really. But did any of us really miss that tag match? I don't think we did, no. So now we're going to the last decade. We're going to the 30s WrestleMania now. So this has been a very long video. I was not expecting this to go this long, but here we are. We've already topped 2 hours. We might even... So if you've been watching this whole time, fair play, with much respect. So WrestleMania 30, there's quite a lot to unpack here, because this was one of the most changed WrestleManias of all time. So let's go long-term plans. And the long-term plan was for a mega match at WrestleMania 30. Quite frankly, what the biggest drawn match that they could have done at the time was Brock Lesnar versus The Rock. So this was going to start on the Raw after WrestleMania 29. They were going to do a big storyline where The Rock came out, and then Brock Lesnar was going to come out and absolutely destroy The Rock, like really beat the shit out of The Rock, and then that was going to lead to a long-term build for The Rock versus Brock Lesnar for WrestleMania 29. But what happened in the match with John Cena at WrestleMania 29, The Rock got injured. I think he tore his abdominal muscle, didn't he? Tore off the pelvis bone. So then Rock had to fly back home and all that, and he couldn't do the angle. So once he couldn't do the angle, and I guess as the year wore on, it realised The Rock wasn't going to be able to do WrestleMania 30 match. The match got scrapped, and then obviously that led to Taker versus Lesnar ending the streak. Now, an interesting one I did hear in late 2013 that when the Undertaker was coming back to WrestleMania, he at least asked WWE to work with Daniel Bryan. I remember hearing that one. That was never the plan, by the way, I don't think. But I think it's a match that the Undertaker wanted, because I'm guessing at that point in his career he thought, he could work with someone smaller and more athletic like Bryan, and then they could have a really good match. But WWE said no. Now is where it gets interesting. Now the big changes for this one. So, I don't want to make any drama out of this, because I remember the internet drama at the time was just ridiculous. The main event for WrestleMania 30 was originally WWE Champion Randy Orton versus Batista. That's right. I mean, yes, believe it or not, there are some imbeciles out there that think this whole messing up with Daniel Bryan in 2030 was part of a huge master plan for him to get his moment at WrestleMania 30. Bullshit. That's just not true. It's the fact that Daniel Bryan was so over with the fans that eventually, and a couple of other factors that eventually made WWE change tactics. So, yeah, this shows how out of touch WWE was with the audience at the time. And let's face it, in the last 8 years, nothing much has changed, really, in that regard, has it? So, Batista's going to make his return to WWE after 4 years away as this all-conquering, all-mighty babyface, and he's going to take out Randy Orton, and fans are going to love it, right? That didn't happen. The fans absolutely hated this idea, turned on Batista big style. And I just got to think, if they'd gone through with this, my God, this would have absolutely yeah, I think fans just would have absolutely hijacked the match completely and just completely shit all over it, really, didn't they? Yeah, and thankfully Cena has prevailed, and we did get Bryan in the match, but that ties into something else. Now, another big match at WrestleMania was supposed to be Triple H versus CM Punk, because that's what they were building to. CM Punk was feuding with Authority in his last month in the company, and that was going to lead to Punk and Triple H having a big match at WrestleMania. But obviously that changed massively when the day after Rumble 2014, CM Punk infamously walked out in the WWE, walked out of a WrestleMania match in a WrestleMania payday. So I think at that point, Triple H then needed another opponent, so that ended up being turned into Triple H versus Bryan. And I think that then they had the easy transition to make, where they just added the stipulation where if Bryan beats Triple H, he gets into the WrestleMania main event. So I do feel like Bryan found to be added to the match anyway, because I just think the fans would have absolutely demanded that. But obviously doing the Triple H match made the transition a little bit easier. So if Bryan wasn't going to be one of these big matches, what was Daniel Bryan originally supposed to do at WrestleMania 30? So in early 2014, Vince brings Bryan to his office. He's going to tell him his WrestleMania opponent, and Bryan's thinking, oh, this is interesting. Because I think Bryan was hoping, was he going to get Shawn Michaels to come out of retirement or something? Vince goes, you know what, pal? I want you to wrestle Sheamus. That's right. The most popular guy in the roster, Daniel Bryan, was going to wrestle Sheamus at this WrestleMania. Oh, good God. Just imagine that. Fucking hell. I mean, that just shows how out of touch Vince was at the time, and let's face it, still is. That Vince's grand plan for WrestleMania was Batista, Orton, Bryan versus Sheamus. Fucking hell. So, this was backed up, by the way, with a sheet CM Punk posted a few years ago on Instagram with the original WrestleMania card in it, with those 3 matches on there. Then the two matches that did happen, John Cena versus Bray Wyatt, Undertaker versus Brock Lesnar, and then there's 2 more matches on that original sheet. One, for some strange reason, is a Big Show versus Kane, and I'm like, what the hell? That would have been weird. And then the main one, Roman Reigns versus Dean Ambrose for the US title. And I remember this rumour at the time, because if you remember, they were early 2014, they were building dissension among the Shield. At this point, it was pretty obvious Roman Reigns was going to be the guy. He was the guy WWE wanted to break out. So it looked like they were building towards Roman Reigns splitting from the Shield, and then Reigns and Ambrose feuding in the singles. This would have left Rollins out in the cold, wouldn't it? I mean, maybe he would have been involved at ringside or something like that. So this was going to lead to Reigns versus Ambrose in a singles match for the US title at WrestleMania. But I think along the way, I think like fans just didn't bite at all. I think fans just did not. I think it was obvious that fans were not interested in seeing the Shield break up, especially when they had that mini feud of the Wyatt family in the Elimination Chamber. I think what happened there was, due to the course of that, the Shield got more popular than ever. So WWE decided to delay the Shield splitting up and then turn them fully fledged babyface, and that led to them facing Kane and the New Age Outlaws at WrestleMania instead. Now, WrestleMania 31, not much here really. This is quite not much changing here really. It's just a few little small ones, and the main one being no cash-in. That's right. So Seth Rollins cashing the Money in the Bank to win the WWE Championship was a fairly late thing. So yeah, Rollins wasn't supposed to cash in the Money in the Bank that night. This only got changed fairly early, later on. I think 2 factors really. One, Roman Reigns was just not getting over like the WWE wanted him to. Fans had kind of rejected Roman Reigns at this point. And then another one big factor, because originally Brock Lesnar was supposed to leave the WWE after this match. His contract was expiring right after WrestleMania 31. And then right at the end of that, but like few days before WrestleMania 31, Brock Lesnar signed a new contract. So the need to So obviously at that point, Roman Reigns was just supposed to beat Brock Lesnar, but they didn't really need to do that anymore. And I guess at the same time, Seth Rollins was really just ready to break out and be the champion. So late on, that probably a couple of days before the show, maybe even that day, they changed it to Seth Rollins coming in and cashing in at the end. They're just a couple of small ones, really, not a lot of changes. One I heard Vince wanted to do Bryan versus Sheamus again. That was definitely pitched to Bryan. Once it was obvious Bryan wasn't going to get his main event this year. And then another rumour I heard that Daniel Bryan wanted to wrestle Dolph Ziggler on this show, but nothing ever came of that, and both guys were in the ladder match instead. And then a small one, I think Goldust versus Stardust was supposed to happen on this show, or there was an idea of it happening on this show, because they had the little feud, and then you had a match of Fastlane, and that match really shit the bed, didn't it? And to this day, I'm not sure why that match just didn't work out so well. It just didn't for some reason. And then I think after that, Vince had all the ammunition he had. He decided he didn't want to do that match anymore. He wasn't interested. And then Cody and Dustin end up just stealing the show Double or Nothing 4 years later instead. Now, WrestleMania 32, there's quite a bit to get through here. This is probably one that, we've got a few more to go. So this is probably one of the most changed WrestleManias of all time. I mean, injuries and all that sort of stuff just changed plans so much. So a long-term plan was for the WrestleMania 32 to be headlined by a big match between The Rock and Triple H. That is what the whole angle at WrestleMania 31 was all about, with Triple H, Stephanie, Rock and Ronda Rousey. Contrary to popular belief, that wasn't going to lead to a tag match. It was going to lead to The Rock versus Triple H, because WrestleMania being in the AT&T Stadium, which is this year, they were hoping to have a big mega 100,000 people in the crowd for all that, and The Rock was going to come back and face Triple H. And that is why WWE justifies Triple H going over Sting, because in their minds they wanted to have Triple H get a strong win at WrestleMania to look strong in the build-up of the facing The Rock at the following year. But I think as time wore on, it was just obvious that The Rock just couldn't do it. The Rock was just far too busy with his filming commitments and all that. And then it just ended up not happening at all. And then The Rock ended up doing a non-wrestling segment on the show. And then another long-term plan that kind of went awry was supposed to be Undertaker versus Triple H. No, sorry, Undertaker versus Brock Lesnar, excuse me, in a big match. Possibly in a Hell in a Cell match. So, after the SummerSlam finished, I think the plan at that point was a Triple H... No, what am I saying? I'm talking shite here. Sorry about this. So Lesnar and Undertaker to blow off the feud at WrestleMania. But if you remember the 2015, that was a year that the WWE ratings declined massively and all that. Ratings started declining, so WWE panicked and brought the feud forward to end at Hell in a Cell instead of WrestleMania. So that was off the table for WrestleMania. And then a big plan. This one I totally believe. The Triple H versus Seth Rollins was originally supposed to happen on this show. Obviously, they had the big match at WrestleMania 33, so it was basically just going to happen a year earlier, because pretty much throughout Rollins' entire title reigns, they were building hints to Seth Rollins and Triple H feuding with each other, weren't they? They were definitely building to this, so I'm guessing Triple H is going to turn on Seth Rollins in maybe late 2015, early 2016. So I think the original plan was for Reigns to defeat Seth Rollins in Survivor Series, and I guess at that point Triple H is going to dump Seth Rollins, and then the feud is going to explode in early 2016 and having this big WrestleMania match. But then Seth Rollins fucked his knee up in November 2015 in that match of Kane and Ireland. Then obviously had to vacate the title, get surgery, and come back at was it Extreme Rules? I think it was Extreme Rules 2016, wasn't it? He came back, and then now that was off the table. And I'm led to believe if Rollins versus Triple H happened, Lesnar versus Reigns was supposed to happen again on this show. What is their obsession with Lesnar and Reigns at WrestleMania? My God! So Lesnar versus Reigns is going to happen again this time. This time for the WWE Championship. Reigns is probably going to win that match, and so obviously that all changed. And then now we revolve around the Undertaker. So once the last match wasn't happening, WWE had a mega match in mind for the Undertaker this year. This time it was going to be nailed on. It was going to happen. Big showdown. Undertaker versus John Cena. this match was penciled in to happen. It was going to happen. It was going to be awesome. And then Cena got injured in January, and now that was off the table. So Undertaker needed an opponent. And then another idea was on the table, which thank God they didn't do. Then an idea was on the table to have the Undertaker face Braun Strowman, which even a year later, 2 years later, that would have been sweet. However, this was Braun Strowman in early 2016. Strowman was nowhere near ready for that kind of match at the time. Think Almost now. Like, imagine if they brought back a legend to face Almost at this year's WrestleMania. That's kind of what we're talking about. So, with Strowman being green and not ready, and Undertaker not really being in the shape to carry someone like Strowman, this probably would have shit the bed and be one of the worst streak matches of all time. And then that led to WWE sending out the SOS. They needed someone, anyone. So then they called Shane McMahon. And that led to Shane coming back to WWE, having that match with The Undertaker. And yes, he lived off that return for years, didn't he? Just thank God he's not going to be at WrestleMania this year. So then another big match that was going to happen on this show, Brock Lesnar versus Bray Wyatt. Now that's an interesting one. That's a match that was penciled in for WrestleMania. Looked like that was going to happen. And you back this up by, they were clearly going that direction at the Royal Rumble when they used the 2016 Royal Rumble match to build interest for this feud. And then something happened along the way. So as a detour, they had a triple threat match at Fastlane between Brock Lesnar, Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose, right? And then in the build-up to that match, Brock Lesnar and Dean Ambrose are having some awesome interactions, which the fans were getting really, really interested in. And I think the real feeling was that the Lesnar-Ambrose interactions were so good and so interesting that WWE changed their minds, decided to scrap the Bray Wyatt and just do Brock Lesnar versus Dean Ambrose. And even though that match wasn't all that good, that ended up being a disappointing match. But the feud and the build-up was pretty good and all that. And to be fair, at that point, I had no desire to see Bray Wyatt versus Brock Lesnar, really. Because I think at that point, Bray had lost so many big feuds that Bray was not really a big threat to Brock Lesnar at all. So yeah, and then just in the simple one, if Ambrose hadn't wrestled Lesnar, it looked like it was probably going to be Dean Ambrose versus Chris Jericho. I think that was going to be the direction we were going to go in, because that is what they did after WrestleMania. And then once Ambrose got paired with Lesnar, they just decided to simply extend the Jericho AJ Styles feud into WrestleMania. And then just a couple of little ones, really. The triple threat match for the women's title was originally not supposed to have Becky Lynch in it. It was planned just to be Charlotte versus Sasha Banks, just one-on-one. But I think what happened was when Becky Lynch and Charlotte were feuding in early 2016 into the Royal Rumble, I think Becky had done such a good job that turned some heads with WWE management. And they're like, okay, she's done a pretty good job here in this one. So I guess they just made the decision to keep Becky Lynch in the storyline and made it a triple threat match instead. And then just another little replacement. Remember the moment of Zack Ryder win the Intercontinental title? He wasn't even supposed to be in the match. So originally, Adrian Neville was supposed to be in this match, and who knows? Maybe Neville would have won the Intercontinental title. I don't know. They probably didn't think that far ahead though. Neville broke his ankle in a match with Chris Jericho about 2 or 3 weeks out from WrestleMania, and then they needed someone else for the ladder match. And then Zack Ryder got the nod, and then Zack Ryder ended up winning the Intercontinental title. So there you go. Now WrestleMania 33, a few ones here as well. So well, not a big one, but a long-term plan was for Brock Lesnar versus Shane McMahon. Yeah, that's right. So, if you remember, at the end of SummerSlam 2016, when Lesnar knocked Randy Orton out, Brock Lesnar ended up giving Shane McMahon an F5, and that was supposed to be a big seed planted for a WrestleMania match between Lesnar and Shane McMahon. And I could honestly see how that was going now. They would have made Shane look super strong against Lesnar. Yeah, they would have made Shane look stronger than 90% of the roster against Brock Lesnar, and he would have came so close to beating him. But then they would have done some crazy, stupid stunt, and Lesnar would have won the match in the end. But two things happened. I think once, Brock Lesnar just wasn't really that interested in wrestling Shane McMahon, and once Goldberg's come back kind of exceeded expectations massively. Then the decision was made to continue Lesnar versus Goldberg and have that story culminate in WrestleMania instead, and that led to Shane McMahon wrestling AJ Styles, and we'll get to AJ Styles in just a minute. So, and then a simple one really. It was going to be Undertaker versus John Cena again in late 2016, early 2017. This was planned for WrestleMania, possibly for the WWE Championship. I'm not sure about that. I'm going to say probably, but Cena versus Taker was back on the table for WrestleMania 33. But along the way, Vince changed his mind because he wanted to give the younger upstart Roman Reigns the rubber work of the Undertaker instead. So because of that, then you had Cena did the stupid mixed tag match with Nikki Bella and Miz and Maurice. But I think before that, originally Reigns was probably going to wrestle Braun Strowman on the show. That's just kind of me guessing, doing the process of elimination type thing. If it was going to be Cena versus Taker, Reigns versus Strowman would have made the most sense. Now, let's go back to AJ Styles. There was an idea on the table for a huge WrestleMania match for AJ Styles. Shawn Michaels coming out retirement to face AJ Styles. So this was never like set in stone or anything. Basically what happened was they were interested in doing this match. AJ was very interested in doing this match because why the hell wouldn't he be? It's Shawn Michaels. And what simply happened was they called Shawn Michaels up, asked him if he wanted to come out of retirement and wrestle AJ Styles at WrestleMania. Shawn Michaels said no, he didn't. He did not want to come out of retirement and wrestle AJ, and that was that. And at the time, I would have said I was glad he didn't come out of retirement. However, now, when knowing that he did come out of retirement for that fucking horrible match with Undertaker and Kane, DX was a Crown Jewel or Super Show. I think it was Crown Jewel, 2018. I wish Shawn Michaels had come out of retirement to wrestle AJ, because even in 2017, I think this match would have been very good to great, to be honest with you. I think if Shawn Michaels had time to train and all that, the match would have been pretty awesome. I really do think that. And I'm just kind of disappointed it didn't happen now. Then it's just a simple one. Simple one here. The Hardy Boys were added to the Raw Tag Team title match quite late in the day. Originally, it was all slated to be Enzo and Cass versus Gallows and Anderson versus Sheamus and Cesaro. And then that changed it to a ladder match, and then the reason why it changed it to a ladder match is because you've got the Hardys secured for this show. I've got to think, just freestyling here, Enzo and Cass were probably going to win the Raw Tag Team titles that night. I mean, I don't know that for a fact or anything, that's just me logically guessing that one. So there's that, and what else have we got? Chris Jericho and Kevin Owens was going to happen, yes, but it was going to be for the Universal title. Chris Jericho said how Vince told him the plan was for this feud to go for the Universal title. Chris Jericho was going to defeat Kevin Owens, and then he was going to lose the title to Brock Lesnar at Payback, which is kind of interesting. That would have been interesting, Lesnar versus Jericho, but then things changed. I think the thought was that Brock Lesnar versus Goldberg was the bigger match and needed the Universal title. So Owens loses the Universal title to Goldberg. We'll not go down that one again. Then Lesnar and Goldberg ended up being for the Universal title. And as a kind of a consolation, Jericho and Owens was for the US title, which was Now, going back to a few minutes ago, big celebrity match on this show was going to be the Big Show taking on Shaquille O'Neal. Now, this was touted, of course, at WrestleMania 28, but it looked much more like it happened at WrestleMania 33. They even had a teasers at WrestleMania 32 where Shaq and the Big Show had a showdown, the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal. Now, I'm still not sure why this match fell through, but it was definitely, at one point, it was on the table to happen. I mean, if you remember, the Big Show got an unbelievable shape, if you remember. I think Big Show lost a good 100 pounds, got basically in the best shape he's ever been in his life for this, in preparation for this match. Now, I'm not sure if maybe it was a money issue, but I think it was on Shaq's part that this match didn't happen. Shaq either didn't want to do it, or WWE weren't willing to pay him what he wanted, or whatever. I'm still not totally sure why this match never happened, why this match ultimately ended up falling through, but it did, and I think it would have been alright. I would have been a decent special attraction more than anything. And then just a simple one, really. American Alpha versus the Usos for the SmackDown Tag Team titles were probably going to happen on this show. But I think the feeling was this card was so bloated, and there wasn't enough room to do American Alpha versus the Usos on this show. Because there was, like, including pre-show, there was like, 15, 16 matches. something like that. There was like a shitload of matches on this show, so then that ended up just happening on the pre-WrestleMania SmackDown instead. Now WrestleMania 34. So we're getting close to the end now, guys. So my God, this video is going long. Well over 2 hours now, isn't it? But so thank you for everyone who's been listening so far. Now WrestleMania 34. So a couple of plans here. The long-term plan was allegedly for John Cena versus Jinder Mahal for the WWE Championship. But obviously originally WWE just wanted to keep the title on Jinder for the foreseeable future. So I'm guessing these plans are made around SummerSlam time, that Jinder was going to keep the title into WrestleMania season and was going to face John Cena, who was going to go for his 16th WWE Championship. And you know it would have been the anti-USA thing as well, wouldn't you? Good God. But yeah, thank God that match didn't happen, to be fair. So obviously Jinder title reign petered out. He lost the title to AJ. And then he was in the US title match, which we'll also get to. Now, the next one, a couple of changes to the Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn versus Daniel Bryan, Shane McMahon match. Now, what I've heard, I don't believe this rumour personally, because it just doesn't seem to make sense. Originally, it was going to be Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn versus Shane and Vince. Yeah, that's one I've heard before, but I don't see that personally, because Vince was, what, 70... He's in his 70s. He was like 72, something maybe at the time. And yes, I know they did the angle where Kevin Owens headbutted Vince on SmackDown in 2017, but I just don't think Vince would have really been up for a match at that age. It just would not have made sense. And then, of course, Daniel Bryan ends up getting cleared, and then it becomes Owens and Zayn versus Bryan and Shane. But that almost never happened, because Shane got sick right 2 or 3 weeks before WrestleMania. I can't remember the exact details, but Shane had a really big illness which threatened his WrestleMania status. So WWE had a backup plan. Returned for one night to step in if Shane couldn't do the WrestleMania match was Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho and Bryan Danielson both talked about this. This was going to happen. So Chris Jericho was doing his New Japan thing at the time, but he didn't have an exclusive deal or anything like that. He was gearing up to face Naito again. He faced Naito at Dominion at the time, so he was in between stuff. He wasn't under contract to anyone, so Chris Jericho was there, ready, willing and able to step in if Shane McMahon couldn't. And that obviously makes sense because of Chris Jericho Kevin Owens feud from the year prior. So in that case, it would have been Bryan and Jericho versus Owens and Zayn. But Shane McMahon was able to make the WrestleMania match, and then we got Shane and Bryan versus Owens and Zayn. What do we got? So, a couple of plans. There was a WWE writer did an interview a few years ago, and he said there was plans in place to do Seth Rollins versus Dean Ambrose. Dean Ambrose was basically going to turn heel a year earlier, and then have a feud with Seth Rollins into WrestleMania. But Ambrose got hurt in early 2018, didn't he? And missed, maybe it was late 2017, maybe. Because the Shields were back together for a bit, weren't they? But then Ambrose obviously went off. And then Kurt Angle versus Jason Jordan. That was a match that was on the table at one point, because they were doing the whole thing. Then Jason Jordan got injured. But after Ambrose got injured, there was also forced to do Seth Rollins versus Jason Jordan as well, because they were the Raw Tag Team Champions for a while, and that was going to lead to Jason Jordan turning heel and facing Seth Rollins. And then just a couple of little ones really, and nothing major. Rusev was added to the US title match quite late on, because it was originally a triple threat match of Jinder Mahal, Randy Orton and Bobby Roode. But fan support for the Rusev deal was so great that WWE added Rusev to the match. I mean, they probably should have had him win the match, but that's a whole issue, another issue entirely. Then a couple of ones which I believe are probably true. They were probably going to go that direction. At one point it looked like it was probably going to be Braun Strowman versus The Miz, possibly for the Intercontinental title. They were building towards that, and then they just kind of dropped it, didn't they? Then obviously Asuka versus Alexa Bliss instead of Charlotte Flair. I think at some point they realised that Asuka versus Charlotte was a much bigger match. And then they want to do that story of Alexa Bliss and Nia Jax. So yeah, now WrestleMania 35, a couple of big ones really. So I've got four change plans here. I think originally it was supposed to be Roman Reigns versus Dean Ambrose for the Universal Championship. This is also before Roman Reigns got leukemia. So I'm virtually certain if that hadn't happened, Reigns just would have been Universal Champion for the rest of 2018 and into WrestleMania 35, because I don't see any other reason why he wouldn't be, to be fair. Don't see why. They basically put the belt back on Brock Lesnar because Roman Reigns had to go away for being sick, didn't he, if you remember? So, and obviously at the time, Ambrose was campaigning to turn heel. So that was apparently what was on the table at one point for Reigns versus Ambrose for the Universal title at WrestleMania. And I've got to think, how much could that have changed things? If Ambrose had gotten a WrestleMania, whether this wouldn't have been the main event, obviously, it would have been the women's match, but if you got a big Universal title match of Roman Reigns at WrestleMania and the storyline went well, would Ambrose have re-signed? I've got to think he would, you know. Yeah, I don't think he would have left. I mean, and then he wouldn't have went to AEW and done all these awesome things he's been doing. So that just could have changed things so much. And now, what was the plan for the WWE Championship? It was going to be Daniel Bryan versus Kevin Owens. That was what was on the table for Daniel Bryan's WWE title match at WrestleMania. And then things changed along the way. Kofi Kingston suddenly got the spot on the elimination. Then suddenly just got super hot. And the fans are really behind him. And then Vince, surprisingly enough, and I'm still kind of surprised he did it. For once, Vince decided to listen to the audience, crazily enough. I mean, what a concept there. Listen to your audience, give them what they want. And that's what they did. In this case, he listened to the audience, pivoted to Kofi and Bryan, and then we got Kofi Mania. And wow, yeah. It was great, and it was great, wasn't it? And then we got... obviously, the WrestleMania was really just going to be Charlotte Flair versus Ronda. I think that was a plan from like a year prior. That was going to be the big plan. It was going to be Charlotte versus Ronda Rousey for the main event of WrestleMania 35. And then, like pretty much in a similar event to Kofi Kingston, Becky Lynch happened. Becky Lynch just got ridiculously over at the time. And then, yeah, WWE went with Becky Lynch, pushed her as a man and all that. And then, instead of in hindsight, they probably should have just done Becky Lynch versus Ronda Rousey. But, of course, Charlotte Flair had to be in that match. So, that turned into a triple threat match. And we're now getting Ronda Rousey versus Charlotte Flair this year. And we'll talk about that one another time. Then, an interesting one, which was kind of odd. John Cena was originally... There was originally an idea for John Cena to wrestle Lars Sullivan at this WrestleMania. Do you remember Lars Sullivan? Yeah. So Lars Sullivan was going to come in, get a monster push, face John Cena at WrestleMania. Although that was the idea. I don't think it was set in stone or anything like that, but that was definitely the idea. And then they were going to have a big match at WrestleMania. I've got to presume Sullivan was supposed to go over, but who the hell knows? And then two things happened. Lars Sullivan had a big anxiety attack before he was supposed to debut, which delayed his debut. And of course, I think it was definitely revolved around all these allegations towards him, which we don't need to get into. If you want to, just look that up if you're interested. And again, just Cena's filming commitment wouldn't allow him to wrestle, basically. Yeah, that's basically it. John Cena was filming a movie at the time. He couldn't get physical in the match, but he did come back at WrestleMania and did that segment with Elias instead. So WrestleMania 36, quite a few things changed in this one. And basically all revolves around the pandemic, but one of them was an obvious creative change. So the first one, long-term plan, was for Roman Reigns versus The Fiend for the Universal title. Roman Reigns was going to slay The Fiend and become Universal Champion again at WrestleMania. And then two switches happened. So John Cena was great to be able, he was able to come back for this WrestleMania, and Cena wanted to work with The Fiend, and then that led to WWE for some reason deciding to put the Universal title on Goldberg. And then we were going to get Cena versus The Fiend, which obviously did happen, and then Reigns versus Goldberg, which is finally going to happen in this Saturday. But that was going to happen, and then obviously the pandemic happened, and then because of his history and all that, Roman Reigns pulled out of that WrestleMania, and then it became Goldberg versus Braun Strowman. But I've heard another plan actually. WWE wanted Goldberg to retain the Universal title and drop the belt to Roman Reigns later, but Goldberg didn't want to commit to any more days past what he was already on. So I heard a strange idea. It was going to be Goldberg versus Jeff Hardy instead of Braun Strowman. Goldberg was going to retain the title against Jeff Hardy, hold on to the Universal title until Reigns is ready to come back, possibly at SummerSlam to face Goldberg. But then with that, then they just decided to put the title on Strowman anyway. Then there are 2 more matches, which is basically pandemic, like coronavirus related. It was supposed to be Rey Mysterio versus Andrade versus Humberto Carrillo versus Angel Garza. And I think at least 2 people were quarantined. Because it was a weird time, because some people were quarantining, some people weren't, and then it was just all a big mess. And I think at least 2 of the people in this match were quarantining, so the match ended up not happening at all. It ended up being Andrade and Garza against the Street Profits instead. And another one which is real simple, the tag match was supposed to be the Usos versus the New Day versus Miz and John Morrison, but the Miz got sick and had to pull out of the match. So instead of doing a tag match, they had Kofi, Morrison and Jimmy Uso in there, and had a singles ladder match for the tag team titles instead. Now last year, so like I said in the intro, we're not going to talk about this year's. We'll probably do that one down the line. So WrestleMania 37, so I've got to think at one point they were looking to do Roman Reigns versus The Rock, but it was real simple. The Rock just didn't do it. I'm guessing he either couldn't do it or he didn't want to do it. Because why would The Rock want to be wrestling a half-full stadium type thing? And I guess he's filling the community, he just didn't want to go there, so that was quickly off the table. Now Edge has said that they thought the plan for WrestleMania was to blow the Edge and Orton rivalry off, because Edge came back in for the Royal Rumble. They had the match at WrestleMania 37 and the greatest wrestler match of all time, kids, at Backlash. So the plan was to have the big blow off at WrestleMania, but plans changed when they decided to have Edge win the Royal Rumble and be in the Universal title match, which also was originally just supposed to be Edge versus Reigns in a singles match, and then that changed it because I think Daniel Bryan got hot again, and then WWE, because I think fan interest in Reigns versus Edge wasn't great, and I think fans are much more interested in seeing Bryan in there, so that changed it to Bryan getting added to the match instead. Now this one I do actually believe was going to happen, really. Now Charlotte Flair versus Lacey Evans. So this is a feud they were building, if you remember, because Lacey Evans was hanging out with Ric Flair. God, how shit was that storyline? Look, in hindsight, not even in hindsight, at the time I knew it was shit. So it was at the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view that Asuka was supposed to face Lacey Evans for the Raw Women's Championship. So I think the idea was Lacey was going to win that match, and then she was going to face babyface Charlotte Flair at WrestleMania 37 for the Raw Women's Championship. But Lacey Evans ended up getting pregnant and pulling out, and she hasn't been back since, so who knows if this storyline will ever be revisited. But I tell you what, I'm so honestly I think that would have shit the bed. The storyline would have been terrible. The fans would not have really been behind Charlotte, and I just think the fans would have just booed the hell out of the match more than anything. It just wouldn't have went well. It just really wouldn't. And that's it. And then we got just a couple that's interesting. So Kofi Kingston talks about plans for him and Mustafa Ali to have a match at WrestleMania. This is obviously going to revolve around Ali being pissed about Kofi stealing his spot, because it was Ali's spot in the Elimination Chamber that Kofi Kingston got, wasn't it? And then that led to Kofi Mania happening. So I'm guessing it would have been it should have been me angle and all that, Ali being the bitter heel facing Kofi Kingston. This would have been a neat little storyline if he did it right, of course. I think this would have been a neat little storyline for WrestleMania. I think I would have been actually quite interested in seeing that one. Probably would have been a nice little undercard match, in fairness, but that never happened. And then the tag match. So I think the plan always was for the tag match, but then if you remember, it was very briefly announced as The Miz versus Bad Bunny, and the reasons for that were that both Morrison and Priest were carrying injuries in the build-up to WrestleMania, so I guess they announced Miz versus Bad Bunny just in case he couldn't make it, but it turned out both Miz and Morrison Morrison and Priest both got cleared shortly before WrestleMania, so then it was back to the original tag match. And that's about it, really, guys. So, wow, long ass video here. So I've really enjoyed doing this one. So thank you guys for watching. Like I said in the intro, I'll have obviously missed the odd one. I mean, there's no way I could have got everything. So if I have missed anything, you comment in the section below. And then until next time, guys, peace.